year was 1875, and the land stretched out like a raw, unfinished piece of God's work. This was the border of Texas and New Mexico, a place where maps were lies and the only real law was the horizon. The grass was endless, a sea of pale yellow that rolled over hills and broke against the high mesas. It was a beautiful, terrible country that demanded everything a person had and promised nothing in return. Towns, when you found them, were just collections of raw lumber and canvas, huddled against the wind. Purgatory Bend was one of these. It was a place of dust. The dust got in your food, in your water, in your lungs. It caked the wagons that rumbled down the single-wide street and settled on the shoulders of the silent men who watched them pass. Out here, the world was full of rumors. You heard the crackle of gunfire in the distance, a flat, popping sound that could be anything. It could be a rancher shooting a coyote, or bandits, or a cavalry patrol. Or it could be the Comanche. Everyone spoke about the Comanche. In the saloon, they were devils with horns. In the church, they were heathens needing salvation. To the men building the railroad, they were an obstacle. The railroad was the other big rumor. It was coming. A snake of iron and steam, pushing west, set to cut right through the heart of the lands the Comanche had ridden for 1,000 years. Clara Reed knew all about the dust. At 19 years old, she felt like she had been breathing it her entire life. She was riding her mare, a sturdy gray named Patience, her eyes scanning the small herd of longhorns. Her father, Thomas, and her older brother, Jacob, were riding the flanks. The work was hard. The sun was a hammer, and her body ached. She pushed a stray strand of damp, brown hair back under her bonnet. Her hands, holding the reins, were chapped and scarred from the rope and lye soap. She was a virgin, but not in the way the romance novels she sometimes dreamed of described. Her innocence was not a fragile, protected thing. It was just a fact, like the color of her eyes. There was no one out here to take it, and no time to think about it. She dreamed of a different life. She had read a book once about Boston, a place with buildings made of stone, streets made of brick, and women who wore gloves that were not for work. She dreamed of conversations that were not about the price of cattle, or the lack of rain, or the fear of attack. But Clara was a good daughter. She loved her family, and she believed in the God her mother prayed to. She believed in morals, and in doing what was right. Her mother, Mary, prayed every night for a good husband for her. Clara was not even sure what that meant anymore. She hoped, quietly, that a good husband would be a kind one, maybe one who bathed regularly and did not smell of dust and chewing tobacco. That seemed like enough to ask. Their home was barely a ranch. It was a small homestead, a sod house built into a shallow hill with a hopeful wooden front porch. Thomas Reed was a man carved from the same hard land he worked. He had fought in the war between the states, on the losing side, and had come home to Georgia with a permanent limp and a deep distrust of governments. He had brought his family west to own something, to be beholden to no man. The small patch of dirt was his, and that, to him, was worth more than any comfort. He was poor, but he was proud. Mary Reed was his anchor. She was a devout, gentle woman who fought the wilderness with a Bible and a bar of soap. She kept the small house spotless, her hands fluttering like captured birds as she worked, but the land terrified her. Clara saw the way her mother's eyes strayed to the fence line, a thin barrier of wood that seemed foolish against the endless, empty space. Mary worried about everything that lived beyond that fence. She worried about drought and snakes and the souls of the men in the saloon, and she worried about the native tribes. The talk in town was louder these days. When Clara and her father went for supplies, the air in the general store and the saloon was thick with it. The name on everyone's lips was Captain Elijah Briggs. Briggs was a cavalry officer, new to the territory. He was ambitious. He had brought a company of soldiers, a few seasoned scouts, and, according to the whispers, a group of civilian volunteers. Clara's father had watched this group ride into town. He had spat in the dust. a rare show of open contempt. "Volunteers," Thomas had muttered to Jacob later that night, his voice low and hard. "Those men are not volunteers. Son, they are cutthroats and bounty hunters, given uniforms to make their killing legal." Captain Briggs, the saloon talk went, was not interested in treaties. He was not interested in reservations. He wanted to clean out the Comanche. That was the phrase he used. Clear them out. Clean the slate. He said it was to make the land safe for families. For the railroad. But the men who owned the land speculation companies and the railroad shares bought him fine whiskey. And the connection was not lost on men like Thomas Reed. One afternoon, a few weeks after first hearing his name, Clara saw something that unsettled her. She was riding near a dry creek bed, looking for a stray calf. The air was still, heavy with heat, patience. Her mare suddenly stopped. The horse's head came up, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. "What is it, girl?" Clara whispered, her hand going to the horse's neck. She felt a prickle on her own skin, a feeling of being watched. She scanned the ridges, her eyes squinting against the glare. There, on the crest of a high butte, outlined against the harsh blue sky, was a man on a horse. He was too far away to see clearly, but he was not a white man. He was lean, naked from the waist up, and sat on his horse with a stillness that seemed part of the rock itself. He was not a soldier. He was not a cowboy. Clara froze. Her heart, which had been beating with the slow rhythm of the afternoon, gave a single, hard jolt, and then began to pound. It felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. He was just a shape, a silhouette of a man, but she felt his gaze. It was impossible, at this distance, but she felt it. It was not like the leering looks of the drifters in town, or the polite, assessing glance of a potential neighbor. It was something else entirely. It was as if he was looking not just at her, but into her, seeing the dust, and the dreams, and the fear. She could not breathe. She could not move. And then he was gone. He did not ride away. He simply was not there anymore. He had melted back into the land, like a shadow when the sun moved. Clara let out a shaky breath. She blinked, wondering if the heat had finally gotten to her. An illusion, a trick of the light. It had to be. But the feeling that remained in her chest was not an illusion. It was a cold, sharp knot, a mixture of a fear so deep it was almost primal, and a tiny, shameful spark of curiosity. The world was built on simple words. In town, at the small wooden church, the preacher spoke of them. There was civilization, which was the town, the church, the railroad, and the people with pale skin. And there were savages, which was everyone and everything else. The mission, the preacher said, was to tame the land and save the heathen. It was their manifest destiny, a phrase that sounded grand and holy. For the Reed family, it was not so simple. They were caught in the middle. They were too poor to be part of the civilization that Briggs spoke of, but they were too white to be left alone. They lived on the edge, fearing the drought, the bandits, and the Comanche who were being hunted, pushed and squeezed until all they had left was rage. A few days after, Clara saw the figure on the ridge. Captain Elijah Briggs rode to their ranch. He did not come alone. He brought 2 soldiers in clean blue uniforms, their brass buttons glinting in the sun. Briggs himself was a handsome man, tall in the saddle, with a neat blonde mustache and eyes the color of a winter sky. He dismounted with an easy grace, taking off his hat as Mary Reed wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. Clara stood behind her, in the shadow of the doorway. "Ma'am," Briggs said, his voice smooth and educated. "Captain Elijah Briggs, at your service." Thomas Reed came around the side of the house, his limp more pronounced, as it always was when he was wary. He did not have his pistol, but he held a large wrench in one hand. "Captain," Thomas said. He did not smile. "Mr. Reed," Briggs acknowledged, his smile unwavering. He turned his attention to the women. "I am visiting all the homesteads in this sector. I want to assure you that the United States Army is here to provide protection." His gaze fell on Clara. It was not a leer. It was something colder, more calculating. It was the look of a man assessing a valuable object. "Especially," he continued, his eyes still on her, "for your family. It is a dangerous time. The Comanche are restless." "We have managed so far, Captain," Thomas said, his voice quiet. "We do not bother them. They do not bother us." Briggs gave a small, indulgent laugh. "My dear sir, that is a dangerously naive view. They are not like us. They do not think like us. They are a threat, a tragedy waiting to happen." He stepped closer to the porch. "It would be a terrible thing," he said, his voice dropping, "if something were to happen to your property or your family. A young woman, out here, alone. It would be a political incident. It would demand a response." Clara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. He was not offering protection. He was not worried about her. He was seeing an opportunity. She realized with a sickening lurch that he was looking at her and seeing a justification. Her capture or her death would be the perfect excuse he needed to unleash his volunteers and start the war he so clearly wanted. She was a pawn, a potential martyr for his ambition. She saw it, but did her father? Thomas Reed stepped forward, moving between Briggs and the porch. He was shorter than the captain, and poorer, and his clothes were stained with dirt, but at that moment, he seemed to fill the entire yard. "My daughter is not a political incident, Captain," Thomas said, his voice dangerously soft. "She is my child, and I will protect my own." The politeness vanished from Briggs's eyes, replaced by a flash of stone-cold arrogance. He looked at Thomas, then at the small sod house, then at Clara. His gaze was dismissive, as if he was looking at something already broken. He put his hat back on. "As you wish, Mr. Reed, but when the time comes, do not say you were not warned." He nodded to Mary, a parody of politeness. "Ma'am, Miss Reed." He swung himself onto his horse, a man in perfect control. He and his soldiers kicked their mounts into a trot, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence that felt heavier than thunder. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was, she thought, the most dangerous man she had ever seen. He was a man who would burn a field just to catch a single rabbit, and she had the terrible feeling that he saw her as the rabbit. That night, sleep would not come. The heat of the day lingered in the small house. Jacob was already asleep, his snores a low rumble. Her parents were quiet in their room. Clara slipped out onto the porch, pulling her mother's old wool shawl around her shoulders, more for comfort than warmth. The air was still, oppressive. The sky was a vast, dark canvas, so full of stars it looked like spilled salt. The sheer size of it made her feel impossibly small, a tiny, breathing thing in a wilderness that did not know or care that she existed. She sat on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees, and listened. The prairie was never truly silent. There was the chirp of crickets, the rustle of some small creature in the grass. And then, far off, came another sound. A wolf, a long, lonely howl that rose and fell, echoing across the darkness. It was a sound of hunger, of solitude, of something wild that would never be tamed. A shiver ran through her, deep and cold. It was not the howl. It was Briggs. It was the man on the ridge. It was the feeling that the thin wooden fence her mother feared was not just a fence, but a line that was about to be crossed. She looked up at the stars, but they offered no answers, no comfort. The land felt like it was holding its breath. She felt it too. Something was coming, moving slowly but surely in the dark. Something that would change her. Something that would change everything. The unease of that night on the porch did not leave her. It settled in the air for the next 2 days, a heavy, static feeling that made the cattle restless and the bread fail to rise. The heat was a physical weight, a wet, hot blanket that smothered the land. It was on the third afternoon that Jacob insisted they move the last of the herd. The grass near the homestead was gone, eaten down to dry, brown roots. "We have to, Clara," Jacob had argued with their father at breakfast. "They will starve if we keep them penned. The grass near the Cimarron cutoff is still good." Thomas Reed had slammed his coffee cup down, his face dark. "The Cimarron is Comanche land. You know the agreement. We do not cross. Briggs is just waiting for an excuse, and a dead Reed boy will be all the excuse he needs." "We will not cross onto their sacred land," Jacob said, his voice stubborn. He was 21 and full of the certainty that bad things only happen to other people. "We will just graze the edge, the forbidden part. No one will know. It is that or lose the herd." Thomas had finally, reluctantly, agreed. So Clara found herself writing patience, her bonnet sticking to her damp forehead, next to Jacob and a pair of hired men. The air was not just hot, it was stagnant, and it smelled wrong. She had noticed it an hour ago, a faint, thin smell on the wind. It was smoke, but not the clean smell of a hearth. It was the acrid, bitter smell of prairie grass on fire, but very far away. "I do not like this. Jacob," she said, her voice quiet, reining her horse closer to his. He wiped his forearm across his brow, leaving a streak of mud. "It is just the heat, Clara, and it spooks the cattle. We will let them graze for a few hours and be home long before supper." Patience tossed her head, her ears swiveling nervously. The cattle ahead of them had stopped moving, bunching together, their heads up, mooing low in their throats. "They smell it, too," Clara whispered. Jacob was about to answer when the world split open. It did not start with a sound, but with a whistle, a high, thin, terrifying sound that seemed to come from the sky itself. One of the hired men, a young man who had just arrived from Missouri, looked up, his mouth open. An arrow, black and fletched with what looked like turkey feathers, appeared in his throat. He made no sound. He just stared, his eyes wide with surprise, and then he slid sideways off his horse and fell into the dust. Then the sound came, a chorus of high, yipping cries, a sound that lived in her nightmares, the sound her mother prayed against. "Comanche!" the second hired man screamed, fumbling for his rifle. They seemed to rise from the earth, warriors on painted ponies, their bodies slick with sweat and paint, their black hair streaming, erupted from the tall grass and the dry creek beds. They were everywhere. Smoke bloomed. They had lit patches of the dry grass, and the wind carried the choking, blinding haze straight into the herd. The cattle went mad, bellowing in terror, turning back on themselves, scattering. "Clara, ride!" Jacob roared. He had his pistol out, firing into the swirling mass of men and horses. "Get to paw ride." She tried. She yanked on Patience's reins, but the horse was screaming, its eyes white, spinning in a circle of pure panic. The second hired man was already down, a lance protruding from his back. Through the chaos, through the smoke and the dust, Clara saw Jacob's horse go down, hit by an arrow in the flank. Jacob was thrown, landing hard on his shoulder. A warrior was on him in an instant, a war club raised. "Jacob!" Clara screamed, her voice a raw thing. And then, as her horse spun again, she saw something else. On the far ridge, at the edge of the fight, there was another group of men, 4, maybe 5. They were not Comanche. They were white men. They were dressed in rough denims and canvas, like the volunteers her father despised. They were not wearing cavalry blue. They had rifles, and they were firing. But they were not firing at the Comanche. They were firing toward Jacob. They were firing at the cattle, driving them, pushing them, fanning the flames of the ambush. They were inciting it. One of them, a thick, bearded man, saw her looking. He turned, and for a heart-stopping second, he leveled his rifle directly at her. It was a trap. The thought was a shard of ice in her brain. Briggs. This was Captain Briggs's work. The man's rifle cracked. The bullet hissed past her ear. So close she felt its heat. The sound, combined with the screaming and the smoke, was the last thing Patience could stand. The mare reared, her front hooves pawing at the sky, a terrible, shrill sound ripping from her throat. Clara, a fine rider her entire life, lost her seat. The saddle horn was slick with her sweat. She felt herself slipping, her hands grasping at air. She hit the ground, the impact driving the air from her lungs in a painful rush. She landed on her back, the world just a blur of yellow dust and smoke and a terrifyingly blue sky. And hooves, the thunder of hooves. She was going to die. She was going to be trampled, crushed into the same dirt she had worked her whole life. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid, a prayer to a God who seemed very far away. A shadow fell across her. A hand, not gentle, grabbed the front of her dress, a fistful of calico and her chemise. She was lifted from the ground, a single, violent pull that felt as if it would rip her in two. She was hauled onto the back of a horse, landing stomach down, her head dangling, her hair sweeping the dirt. The horse was already moving, a powerful, lunging beast. She was choking on dust, on her own hair, on her own terror. She was alive. She was a captive. The warrior pulled her upright, settling her in front of him on the horse's withers. He was hot, his body radiating a furnace heat. He was lean, all sinew and muscle, and he smelled of sweat and horse and the acrid smoke. He turned his head to look at her, to make sure she was secure, and Clara's heart stopped. It was him. The man from the ridge, the illusion, the shape against the sky. He was real. He was here. His face was painted, stripes of black and red across his high cheekbones, but his eyes were the same, dark, intense, bottomless. They were not the eyes of a savage from a preacher's sermon. They were the eyes of a man, and he was looking at her as if he knew her. His name was Kian, and he had just stolen her from her life. He kicked the horse, a pinto with a wild eye, and the animal leaped forward. Clara twisted, her body screaming in protest. "Jacob!" she shrieked. She saw him. He was on his feet, his left arm hanging uselessly, blood staining his sleeve, but he was alive. He was scrambling for his horse, which had struggled to its feet. And she saw her father. Thomas Reed had heard the shots. He was riding his big plow horse, his face a mask of pure, primal agony. He was too far. He was 100 yards away, 1,000 miles. He had his rifle, and he raised it. He was the best shot in the county, but he could not take the shot, not with his daughter in the way. "Clara!" he bellowed. His voice, a sound she had known all her life, a sound of comfort and safety, was broken, ripped apart by a grief so profound it was a physical thing. The name was stolen by the wind as Kian's pinto joined the stream of other riders, leaping over a dry creek bed and disappearing into the rocky hills. The world she knew was gone. The first hour was a blur of terror. Clara did the only thing she knew how to do. She fought. She pounded on his chest with her bound fists. She kicked, her boots trying to find purchase, trying to unseat them both. "Let me go!" she screamed until her throat was raw. "In the name of God, let me go!" He said nothing. He simply absorbed the blows, his body as hard and unyielding as the rock formations they rode through. He did not hit her. He did not curse her. He simply reached down, his movements economical and swift, and captured both of her flailing wrists in one of his grip was iron. With his other hand, he grabbed a fistful of her hair, just at the nape of her neck. She cried out, expecting him to rip it from her scalp. But he just held her head still, steadying her. She collapsed against him, her strength gone, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. She began to pray, the words a silent, frantic litany in her mind, Our Father, who art in heaven, holy be thy name. Tears came, hot and useless, cutting trails through the dust and grime on her face. Deliver us from evil. She became aware of him, of the man holding her, in a way that was new and terrifying. His arm was a steel bar across her waist, pinning her to him, and she realized, through the fog of her panic, what he was not doing. His hand was not groping. It was not searching or exploring or taking advantage of her helplessness. His hand rested firmly on her hip, just above the bone, a practical, impersonal grip. It was the grip of a man holding a sack of flour, or a child, or anything he did not want to fall. He was holding her so she would not fall. The realization did not comfort her. It confused her, which was in some ways worse. They rode for hours. The sun was a hammer, beating down on them. They left the familiar grasslands and entered the Badlands, a maze of red rock canyons and high, wind-sculpted mesas. This was the land her father had warned her about, a place where a white man could get lost and never be found. Her terror slowly gave way to a bone-deep exhaustion. Her body, unaccustomed to this kind of riding, was a single, throbbing ache. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a numb weariness. She started to look, to observe. The warriors were not a random, chaotic mob. They rode with a fierce, practiced discipline. There were scouts far ahead, and a rear guard of older, scarred men. And they were not just warriors. As they rounded a high pinnacle of rock, she saw the rest of the party. Moving in the center of the armed group was a long, slow column. Women, children, some so small they were strapped to their mothers' backs. Old men, their faces like wrinkled leather, riding ponies as stoic as they were moving their entire people. This was not a raid for scalps or horses. This was a flight, migration under duress. The white men, the men who had fired on her, they were not just caught in a raid, they were... Her head spun. The logic was too terrible. Briggs had used the Comanche's move as an excuse. He had sent his men to start a fight, to turn a flight into a massacre, so he could claim he was responding to an attack. And she, her brother, her family had been the bait. As the sun began to bleed purple and orange over the western rim of the world, they finally stopped. They filed into a deep, hidden canyon with high walls and a small, algae-choked spring at one end. Kian slid from the pinto, his movement as fluid as water. He reached up for her. Clara flinched, but he grabbed her by the waist and swung her down. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled. She would have collapsed into the dirt if he had not held her. He pushed her, none too gently, toward a large, flat rock. She fell onto it, her skirt and petticoats bunching around her. The canyon was a hive of controlled activity. Women were already building small, smokeless fires. Children, silent and wide-eyed, were led to the water. Warriors were tending to their horses, the most valuable things they owned. Kian spoke to an older, barrel-chested warrior, his voice low and fast. The older man's face was a map of old scars. He looked at Clara, his eyes flat, black, and full of hate. He spat in the dust near her feet and said something that sounded like a curse. Kian argued, his voice rising, insistent. The older man shook his head, gesturing to her, then to the camp, then back the way they came. A cold sickness filled Clara. They were arguing about her, about what to do with her. Kian turned from the man and strode back to her. He held a length of rawhide. "No," Clara whispered, the word dry in her throat. She held up her hands. "Please, I will not run. I cannot run." He did not meet her eyes. He took her wrists, his touch surprisingly gentle, and bound them in front of her. Not tight enough to cut the skin, but tight enough. There would be no escape. He left her. She sat on the rock, her hands bound, her dignity stripped away. She was the center of attention. Every woman who passed, every child, every warrior, stopped to look at her. The women's faces were hard to read. Some looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred, others with a kind of weary pity. A group of younger warriors, their faces still bright with paint, swaggered past. They stopped, pointing at her, laughing. They spoke in their language, but the meaning was universal. A prize, a spoil of war. One of them, bolder than the rest, reached out as if to touch her hair. Kian was there in a bind. He slammed the young warrior against the canyon wall, his hand on the man's throat. He hissed a string of words, his voice a deadly weapon. The young man's eyes went wide, and he backed away, followed by his friends. Kian returned to her. He carried a water skin and a heavy wool blanket that smelled of smoke and horses. He knelt in front of her. He untied her hands. She stared at him, suspicious. He pushed the water skin toward her. "Drink," he said. The word, in English, shocked her so much she almost dropped the skin. His accent was thick, the word clipped. She snatched it and drank. The water was warm and tasted of minerals, but it was the most glorious thing she had ever known. He held out the blanket. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and warm. He held up the rawhide. She nodded, her pride gone. She held out her wrists, and he tied them again, more loosely this time. He did not go to the fires. He did not join the other men. He did not go to bed. He sat 10 feet away from her, his back to the canyon wall, his knees drawn up. He pulled his own blanket around his shoulders, and he watched. But he was not watching her. He was watching the camp. His eyes, alert and sharp, never stopped moving. He was a sentinel. He was a guard. She realized, with a new, dawning horror, that he was protecting her. He was not protecting the camp from her. He was protecting her from the camp, from his own people. This changed everything. It meant she was not safe. It meant she was a spark in a field of dry grass. She lay down on the hard, cold rock, pulling the unfamiliar blanket around her. It was then that the tears came, the ones she had been holding back. They were not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, hot tears that slipped from the corners of her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her temples. She was 19 years old. She was a virgin. She was a captive. She thought, a spoil of war. She knew what that meant. She had heard the stories. She would be sold, or traded, or worse. She would be passed among the warriors. The thought made her stomach heave, a dry, sick retching. She would die first. She would find a way to die first. She looked up. The sky was a gash of black velvet, punctured by 1,000,000 diamond-sharp stars. They were the same stars that had looked down on her father's porch. They seemed cold now, mocking, indifferent. She cried until her body was a hollow, empty shell. Across the small space, Kian sat, his face a mask of stone in the faint moonlight. He had not slept. He was a young warrior, and he had done something his people might not forgive. He had brought a white woman, the daughter of his enemy, into a camp that was running for its life. He had saved her from being trampled. He had saved her from the cruel men his people called volunteers, and in doing so, he had chained himself to her fate. He had to explain this. He had to explain it to the elders, to the warriors who had lost brothers, to the women who had lost children. He had to explain why, in a world of pure hate, he had chosen to save one of them. He stared into the darkness, the weight of his decision as heavy as the rocks around them. The long, terrible night had just begun. They traveled for another day and a half, pushing deeper into a land that felt older and harsher than anything Clara had ever known. The world was reduced to the burning sun, the agonizing rhythm of the horse, and the hard, unyielding line of Kian's back. She was given water when they stopped, and a piece of dry, tough meat in the evenings. She ate because her body demanded it, but the food tasted like ashes. Her wrists were untied when they rode. But Kian's presence was a stronger bond than any rawhide. On the third morning since her capture, they crested a high mesa. Kian reined in his pinto, and the entire column of people came to a halt, a collective sigh seeming to pass through them. Below them, in a wide, shallow valley protected by red rock cliffs, was their home. It was not the collection of crude huts she might have imagined. It was a true village, a sprawling, organized circle of over 100 tall teepees, their smoked tops pointing to the sky. Fires burned, and the air was filled with the sounds of life. Dogs barked, children shouted, and from the center of the village, the steady, rhythmic beat of a single drum throbbed in the air. Women and children, those who had stayed behind, came running out to meet them, their voices rising in a mix of calls and wails. The returning warriors sat straighter on their horses, but their faces were grim. They were not returning as victors. They were returning as survivors. And then they saw her. The welcome cries died in their throats. The shouting children fell silent, hiding behind their mothers' leather skirts. The village, so full of life a moment before, became utterly quiet. All that remained was the wind, the crackle of the fires, and the endless hollow beat of the drum. Every eye in the valley of the women, the children, the old men who hobbled from their teepees was on her, on the white woman, her calico dress ripped and filthy, her hair a matted tangle, sitting in front of Kian, their most promising young warrior. She was the center of 100 hateful, curious, and fearful stares. She felt them like physical blows, like stones being thrown. She was contaminated. She was an omen. She was a prize. She was something that did not belong, and her presence was an insult. Kian slid from his horse and pulled her down. His touch was firm, impersonal. He kept his hand on her upper arm, his grip just short of pain, and began to half-drag, half-led her toward the largest teepee in the center of the camp. The crowd parted for them, a silent, hostile sea. Clara kept her eyes on the ground. She looked at the dusty, worn moccasins, the bare, brown feet of the children. To look up, to meet those eyes, would be to break. She was pushed into the large teepee. It was smoky and dim inside, but much larger than she expected. A fire burned in a central pit, the smoke rising to the hole in the roof. Over a dozen men sat in a circle on buffalo robes. They were the elders, the council. Their faces were like maps of the land they lived on, carved with lines of wisdom, sorrow, and unbending resolve. At the head of the circle sat one man who was clearly the chief. He was ancient, his hair as white as winter snow, but his eyes were black and sharp, and they missed nothing. Kian began to speak. He spoke for a long time, his voice low and urgent. He gestured back the way they came, his hands painting pictures of the battle, of the men in cavalry blue, of the volunteers. Clara stood, her knees shaking, a prisoner at the bar. She did not understand a single word, but she understood the meaning. She was on trial. When Kian finished, an older warrior, the one with the scarred face from the canyon, began to speak. His voice was a harsh, guttural bark. He spat his words, and everyone seemed to be aimed at her. He pointed at Clara, then at his own chest, then mimed the act of firing a rifle. He was recounting their losses. He was blaming her. He was saying she knew that her presence would bring the army, the blue coats, the end of everything. Then another man spoke. This one was younger, not much older than Kian, but with a cruel mouth and eyes that held no light. He was strongly built, with an arrogance in the way he sat. His name, she would learn, was Tush. Tashe laughed at the scarred warrior. He dismissed the man's fears with a wave of his hand. He looked at Clara, his gaze slimy, undressing her where she stood. He spoke, and his words were punctuated by crude laughter from a few other young men in the circle. He licked his lips. He was not talking about army retaliation. He was talking about her. He was She realized with a cold wave of pure bile, talking about what they would do with her. She felt like a horse at an auction. She was being weighed, measured, valued. Some, like the scarred man, saw her as a burden, a danger. Others, like Tashi, saw her as property, a chen loi femme, a plaything. Tashi gestured at her, then made a motion of throwing dice. He was suggesting. She sensed that they share her, that the warriors who had fought should have their reward. Kian's body, which had been tense, went rigid. He stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He and Tashi began to argue, the words flying like knives. The chief watched, his face impassive. Tashi was loud, arrogant, feeding off the support of his friends. He was mocking Kian, questioning his courage. Why save her? Why bring this trouble? Unless he was weak, unless he was a friend to the White Eyes. Kian, she saw, was losing. The logic of hate was on Tasha's side. The logic of fear was on the scarred warrior's side. He had no allies. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had isolated himself. He stopped arguing. He stood still for a long, terrible moment. The teepee was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Kian looked at the chief. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. It was not angry. It was not pleading. It was formal. It was steady. It was the voice of a man making a sacred vow. He said a few words. The reaction was immediate. Tashi stopped laughing. His face contorted with pure, uncomprehending rage. He leaped to his feet, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The scarred warrior's jaw dropped. Even the old chief's eyes widened. Just for a second. Kian had not moved. He stood, his gaze locked on the chief. Clara looked around, frantic. What had he said? What single word could so enrage one man and shock all the others? The chief studied Kian. He looked at the furious Tasha. Then his eyes, old and heavy, settled on Clara. He looked at her for a long time. He was not looking at her body, like Tash had. He was looking at her face, at the terror in her eyes, at the ruin of her dress. He was looking at her as if she was, for the first time, a person. He nodded. Once, a small, reluctant movement. It was done. Tashi bellowed, a sound of pure animal fury. But the chief spoke one sharp word, and Tashi froze. He shot Kian with a look of such venomous hatred that Clara flinched. Then he stormed from the teepee. Kian's shoulders slumped, just for an instant, as if a great weight had settled on them. Two women entered the teepee. They were older, their faces hard but not cruel. They took Clara by her arms. She tried to pull away, her heart seized by a new panic. No, what are you doing, Kian? She looked to him, her self-appointed guardian. He would not meet her eyes. She was taken to a smaller teepee. The women were strong. They did not hurt her, but their grip was non-negotiable. They stripped her of her ruined dress, her petticoats, her chemise, until she stood naked and shivering in the dim light. Her hands crossed over her chest, her shame complete. She expected to be hurt. She expected to be violated. Instead, they washed her. They used a rough cloth and cold water from a skin bag, scrubbing her skin with a methodical, impersonal efficiency. They were washing the white world off her. They gave her a simple, sleeveless dress made of the softest deer hide she had ever felt. It was clean and smelled of wood smoke. Then they began the ritual. One woman brought a small pot of red earth mixed with water. She took Clara's left hand and, with her thumb, painted a red circle in her palm. She did the same to the right. Clara did not understand. She was frozen in a state beyond simple fear, a place of numb, surreal horror. They led her back outside. The sun was setting, casting the village in a blood-red light. The drum was beating faster now. Kian was waiting for her, standing in front of the chief's teepee. He, too, had been changed. The war paint was gone. His face was clean, and he wore a simple buckskin shirt. The chief stepped out and began to chant, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. He was praying to his ancestors, to the spirits of the wind and the rock. A heavy blanket, painted with symbols she did not recognize, was brought. The chief motioned, and the two women draped it over Clara's shoulders. It was heavy, a symbolic weight. The chief laid his hand on Kian's shoulder, then on Clara's. He spoke one final word. The drum stopped. It was over. She had just been married. The villagers, who had gathered in a wide, silent circle, began to disperse. The ritual, whatever it was, had been binding. She was no longer a prize to be fought over. She was a wife. Kian turned to her. His face was a mask of exhaustion. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a complicated mix of emotions she could not begin to name. Pity, regret, apology. He leaned in close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. His next words would be the first and last words of English he spoke that night. "Mary," he whispered, the word thick, as if it was unfamiliar on his tongue. He touched the blanket on her shoulder. "Protect you." He saw the blank terror in her eyes. He had to make her understand. He looked over her shoulder, to where Tache was standing in the shadows, his eyes still burning with hatred. Kian's face hardened. He looked back at her. "No man touch." And with that, he took her arm and led her to a small teepee on the edge of the camp. His teepee. He pushed the flap aside, motioning for her to enter. This was it, the marriage, the protection. It was all a lie, a cruel, elaborate trick. The word husband meant the same thing in his language as it did in hers. She was his. She stumbled inside, her mind a screaming void. The teepee was small, clean, and contained the sparse belongings of a single warrior: a sleeping robe of buffalo hide, a weapons rack, a small fire pit, cold. She backed against the far wall of the teepee, her hands, their palms still stained red, pressed flat against the taut hide. She searched frantically for a weapon, a knife, a heavy rock. There was nothing. The flap opened, and he filled the entrance, blocking the last of the dying light. Clara began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "No," she whispered, her voice a strangled sound. "Please, do not, please, God, no." She was ready to fight. She would rake his eyes. She would bite his throat. She would die here, on this dirt floor. But she would not be taken. Kian stood, just inside the flap, and watched her. He watched her terror, her shaking hands, her eyes wide and wild with the certainty of her fate. He did not move toward her. He let the flap fall, plunging the teepee into near darkness, lit only by a sliver of the moon through the smoke hole above. Clara tensed, her muscles coiled, ready for the attack. Kian let out a long, slow breath. It was the sound of a man who had run 20 miles and could finally rest. He walked, not to her, but to the center of the teepee. He bent down and picked up a pile of folded blankets and a thick sleeping robe. He walked to her side of the teepee and dropped them at her feet. "This," he said, tapping the blankets. He did not seem to have a word for it. Then he walked to the other side of the teepee, the side with the door flap. He took his own blanket, a single, thin one, and sat down. He did not lie down. He sat, his back against the teepee pole nearest the entrance. He pulled the blanket around his shoulders. He reached for his long hunting knife and laid it on the ground to his right. He took the rifle he had carried in and laid it to his left. And then he turned his back to her. He was a warrior. He was her husband, and he was sitting guard. Clara did not move for a full minute. She simply stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders. He was not a husband. He was a sentinel. He was the barrier. He was not protecting himself from her. He was still protecting her from his own people, from Tash, from any man who might still see her as a spoil of war. The marriage was a law, a piece of political theater to give him the right to guard her. She slid down the wall of the teepee, her legs giving out. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. She pulled the blankets he had given her, burying her face in the thick, smoky fur. She was filled with a white-hot, choking rage. Rage at Briggs, rage at Tush, rage at her father for not being able to protect her, and a confused, terrified rage at the man sitting 10 feet away. He had saved her life, and in doing so, had destroyed it. He had trapped her, bound her to him in a ceremony she did not understand, to save her from a fate he himself had exposed her to. She was furious, and she was, for the first time in 3 days, not afraid for her life. She was just completely, utterly, and terrifyingly lost. Outside, the dogs barked, the fires of the village crackled. A baby cried somewhere, and was quickly hushed. Inside the small teepee, 2 people sat in the dark. They did not speak, they did not sleep, they just listened to the sound of each other's breathing. A young woman who had lost her world, and a young man who had just taken on the weight of a new one. The night, the first of their marriage, stretched out, endless and silent. The first morning, Clara woke with a stiff neck in the disoriented panic of a new, terrible reality. Kian was already gone. The teepee was empty, save for the buffalo robe she lay on and the weapons he had left by the door. She had slept, eventually, from pure, ragged exhaustion, and he had kept his word. He had sat by that door, a silent guardian, until the first hint of gray light. Life in the village began before the sun. The sound that woke her was not a bird or a rooster. It was a drum. A single, low, steady beat that was. She would learn. The heartbeat of the camp. Thump-dump, thump-dump. It was the call to a new day. She crept to the teepee flap, her heart in her throat, and peered out. The village was alive. Smoke rose from dozens of fires. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and a strange, musky smell she later learned was sage. Women were already at work, a river of motion. Some were gathered around a large, hollowed log, pounding corn with heavy wooden pestles, their rhythm matching the drum. Thump-dump, thump-dump. Others were scraping hides, their knives flashing, or carrying heavy skins of water from the spring. Children, naked and brown, tumbled in the dust, their laughter sharp and clear. Dogs, lean and wolfish, yapped and fought over scraps. To Clara, it was chaos. It was loud, foreign, and frightening. It was exactly what the preacher had described. It was, to her eyes, savage. She shrank back into the teepee, her stomach churning. She was a woman from a quiet home, a home of silent prayers and the gentle hum of her mother's spinning wheel. This was a nightmare. An hour later, Kian returned. He did not speak. He ducked into the teepee and dropped a piece of cooked meat on a clean, flat stone near her. It was hot and smelled of grease and salt. She stared at it. He then motioned for her to follow him. "Where?" she asked, her voice a croak. He did not seem to understand the word. He just pointed outside, his face impassive, and waited. She followed. He led her to the spring, a shallow, muddy pool on the edge of the camp. The women who were there, filling their water skins, all stopped. Their dark eyes followed her, a wave of open hostility and suspicion. Clara felt her face burn with shame and fear. Kian spoke a few sharp words to the women. They did not move, but their gazes, if possible, grew colder. He pointed to a large, empty water skin near her feet. The message was clear. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner to be locked away. She was a wife, and wives worked. He left her there. He walked away to join the other men who were gathering their horses, their bows, their rifles. He was going to hunt, or train, or patrol. He was going to be a warrior. And she was left alone, A white woman in a deerskin dress, surrounded by her enemies, her new family. It was the longest day of her life. She filled the skin, her hands fumbling, spilling more water than she gathered. The women watched. One of them, a young woman with a baby on her hip, spat on the ground near Clara's feet. Clara wanted to run, to scream, to throw the water skin at them. But where would she run? She was hundreds of miles from anything she knew. So she did the only thing she could. She lowered her head, picked up the impossibly heavy skin, and hauled it back to Kian's teepee, her shoulders on fire, her pride in shreds. The days that followed fell into a brutal, monotonous pattern. Kian was true to his promise, in a way that was almost more agonizing than if he had broken it. By day, he was gone. He was a man of importance in the tribe. She quickly saw. He led the hunting parties. He taught the young boys to track. He was admired, respected. And at night, he returned. He would bring food rabbit or deer or that tough, dry corn cake. They would eat in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the small, cold fire pit. He never lit a fire inside. It was too warm, and she suspected, too intimate. He would speak to her, sometimes, a single new word of English, learned from God knows where. One night, he pointed to the water skin. "Water," he said, his voice rough. Clara, stunned, had just nodded. Another night, he had returned from a hunt, a cut high on his cheek. He had looked at her, his face grim, and pointed to the blue-coated soldiers in his imagination. "Briggs," he said, the name a curse. Then he looked at her, and with a rare, fleeting bit of frustration, he said, "Bad, he is bad." And on one occasion, a night when the moon was full and the children were loud, he had returned and found her weeping, her silent tears of homesickness. He had stood for a moment, and a strange, soft look had crossed his face. It was not a pity. It was something closer to recognition. He had reached into a pouch and pulled out a small, dried flower, a brittle, purple thing. He had set it on the stone between them, and then turned away, a rare, almost invisible smile. But every night, the ritual was the same. He would give her the thicker buffalo robes. He would take his own thin blanket. He would sit by the door, his weapons at his side, his back to her, a husband who was a jailer, a protector who was a captor. The women of the village remained her greatest trial. They were divided in their opinion of her. Most, like the woman who had spat, despised her. They saw her as a bad omen, a white devil who had bewitched Kian. They muttered as she passed, and sometimes a child, emboldened by his mother's hate, would throw a small stone at her. A few, the very old women, seemed to look at her with a weary pity. They were the ones who had seen it all, seen their own children killed, their lands taken. To them, Clara was not an enemy. She was just another victim, a piece of driftwood caught in the same bloody flood that was drowning them all. And then there were the young women, the unmarried women. They were, perhaps, the worst. Kian was 24, strong, a great hunter, and a proven warrior. He was, Clara realized, the most eligible man in the village, and he was now, by law, hers. Their jealousy was a sharp, pointed thing. They watched her with a special kind of loathing. She was the pale, clumsy, useless woman who had stolen what should have been theirs. One woman in particular, a tall, beautiful girl with eyes like black obsidian, would often follow her, walking right behind her, humming a low, menacing song. Clara was utterly, profoundly alone. The tension that simmered under the surface of the camp finally erupted, as she knew it must, and the spark, as she knew it would be, was Tush. He had not forgotten his humiliation in the council teepee. He had not forgiven Kian for winning, and he had not forgiven Clara for being the prize. She was gathering firewood, a task she had been assigned, at the edge of the woods. She was always on edge, her ears straining, but she had become careless. She was thinking of her mother, wondering what she was doing at this exact moment. The white squaw learns to work. The voice, thick with contempt, came from behind her. She spun, dropping her bundle of sticks. Tache was there, leaning against a cottonwood tree. He was not alone. 2 of his friends were with him, their faces set in cruel, eager grins. "You are far from your teepee," Tache said, pushing himself off the tree. He spoke in Comanche, but his tone was universal. "Leave me alone," Clara said, her voice shaking. She began to back away. He laughed. "Your husband is not here. White woman. He is gone. Hunting, always hunting. Maybe he is tired of his new wife." He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "He is a fool. To take a prize like you, and just look at it. I am not such a fool." "Get out of my way," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. He reached out, his hand closing on her arm. His grip was brutal, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You are skinny," he sneered, pulling her closer. "Like a white bird, but maybe you can be taught to sing." "No!" Clara shrieked, twisting, trying to beat at him with her free hand. "Let me go, Kian!" She screamed his name, a desperate, hopeless cry. Tache's face darkened with rage. He raised his hand and slapped her, a hard, open-palmed blow that sent her staggering. She fell to her knees, the side of her face exploding in pain, the taste of blood in her mouth. "You will not scream his name," Tache hissed, grabbing a handful of her hair, yanking her head back. "You will learn my name." "I think she already knows it." The voice was quiet, deadly. Tache froze. He turned, his hand still tangled in Clara's hair. Kian was standing 10 feet away. He was not on a horse. He had come on foot, silent as a ghost. He held his hunting bow in one hand, a fresh kill, a rabbit dangling from the other. His face was a mask of such cold, lethal fury that even Tache's friends took a step back. He dropped the rabbit. He let his bow fall to the ground. He had only the knife at his hip. "Let her go, Tache," Kian said, his voice a low rumble. Tache, seeing Kian was armed only with a knife, regained his courage. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. He threw Clara to the ground. "Or what? Whiteheart, you will have your wife protect you." He drew his own knife. "She is white. She is a curse. You shamed us by marrying her. I will remove the shame. And then, I will take her." What happened next was too fast for Clara to follow. Kian did not charge. He did not yell. He moved. 1 second he was 10 feet away. The next he was on Tache. It was not a fight. It was a storm. Kian's hands were a blur. He did not go for his knife. He hit Tache in the throat with the heel of his palm. As Tache gagged, Kian slammed his elbow into the man's temple. He grabbed Tache's knife hand, and Clara heard a sickening snap. Tache screamed, a high, thin sound as his knife clattered to the ground. Kian spun him around, his arm locked around Tache's neck, and Kian's own knife was suddenly free. Its point pressed so hard against Tache's stomach it drew a drop of blood. The entire thing had taken less than 5 seconds. Tache's 2 friends had not even moved. Kian was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He was a different person from the quiet, brooding man who sat by her door. This was the warrior. He spat a stream of furious Comanche at the 2 frozen friends. They scrambled to help Tache, who was sobbing in pain and humiliation, his arm broken. Kian did not take his eyes off them until they had vanished into the trees, dragging their leader with them. Then, the fury left him. His shoulders slumped. He turned, and the mask was back, but his eyes were still dark with the storm. He walked to Clara. She was still on the ground, her hand on her bleeding lip, her body shaking so hard she could not stand. He looked at the red mark on her face, at the blood on her chin. He reached out his hand. She flinched, scrambling backward. His face tightened. He had just defended her, fought for her, and she still looked at him like he was a monster. He turned his back on her, his body rigid with an anger she could not understand. He picked up his bow. He picked up the rabbit. He started walking back to the village. Clara, left alone, was overcome with a new kind of terror, the terror of being left behind. She scrambled to her feet and ran after him, stumbling, sobbing, her honor and her pride a ruin in the dust. That night was the worst yet. He did not sit by the door. He sat outside the teepee, in the cold, a visible, fuming sentinel. She was inside, crying, holding the buffalo robe to her chest. She hated him. She hated him for bringing her here. She hated him for forcing this marriage. She hated him for making her a prize for men like Tesh. And in a small, secret, terrifying part of her heart, a new feeling was growing. He had protected her. He had defended her honor. He had called her his wife, and he had meant it. He had fought for her. No man had ever fought for her before. The thought made her sick with guilt. This was a devil, a savage. He was her captor, but her own body, her own traitorous instincts, were telling her something different. They were telling her that the man who had just broken another man's arm for her was not the monster she had been taught to fear. This internal war was more terrifying than Tash. 2 nights later, she made her decision. She could not stay. She could not be this person, this wife of a savage, this object of hate and jealousy. She was Clara Reed, of Purgatory Bend. She was a Christian. She was her father's daughter. She had to go home. She had been saving for a week. She had hidden a small portion of the dry corn cake he gave her. She had stolen a small, empty water skin from the spring. That night, she waited. Keon had returned, exhausted from a long patrol. He sat by the door, but his posture was weary. His breathing, for the first time, was deep and even. He was asleep. Clara's heart was a hammer against her ribs. "Now, go now." She crept, silent as a shadow, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She slipped past his sleeping form. She was outside. The village was dark. The fires were low embers. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light. She did not run. She walked. She walked, her head down. Just another shadow, toward the edge of the camp. She passed the horse enclosure, the smell of the animals making her heart ache for patience. She was at the tree line. She was free. She ran into the blackness, into the wilderness, her only guide the faint light of the stars. She did not know where she was going. She just knew she was going away. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs were jelly. She scrambled up a rocky embankment, the stones cutting her feet. She fell. She rose. She kept going. The land was a black, terrifying maze. The world was silent, and she was alone. And then the wind picked up. It came on suddenly, a low, rising moan. The stars disappeared. The air, which had been still, was suddenly full of grit, a sandstorm. Within minutes, she was blind. The air was a choking, stinging wall of sand. She could not see her own hand in front of her face. She fell to her knees, pulling her deer-hide dress over her head, gasping for air that was too thick to breathe. She was lost. She was going to die here, choking on sand, buried in a nameless grave. She screamed, but the wind tore the sound from her lips. And then she heard it. A sound, so close it made her jump. A dry, rattling, buzzing sound, the sound of death in this country. A rattlesnake. She froze. It was close, in the dark. She didn't know which way to move. To move at all was to die. A hand grabbed her. It was not a snake. It was a man. It clamped over her mouth, silencing her scream. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her from the ground. "Be still." Keon's voice was not a whisper. It was a hiss, right in her ear, more terrifying than the snake. He stood motionless, holding her against him, her feet dangling above the ground. He was listening. She could feel his body, coiled and alert. The rattling had stopped. He began to move, walking backward. Slow, measured steps, never letting her touch the ground. He carried her for 50 yards before he finally set her down, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind. He was furious. She could feel it. It was a cold, silent rage that was far more terrifying than Tasha's hot-headedness. He grabbed her wrist and began to drag her. He knew this land. Even in the dark, even in a storm, he was taking her back. When they reached the relative haven of the teepee, he threw her inside. He lit a flame, his movements angry and jerky. For the first time, a small fire lit the dark space. His face, in the flickering light, was terrible. He was not the calm guardian. He was not the awkward boy with the flower. He was a man who had been betrayed. "You are a fool," he said, the English words sharp, biting. "You cannot keep me!" Clara shrieked, her terror and her failure and her shame all boiling over. She was on her knees, pounding the dirt floor. "I am not your wife. I am not one of you. I hate you. I want to go home." "Home!" he yelled back, his own control finally breaking. "Home is gone. Home is where Briggs is. Home is where they shoot you. Home is where you die." He pointed to the rattlesnake's territory. "You die out there, the snake, the storm, or Tashe. He follows you, he waits for you. He will find you, and you will pray for the snake." Clara sobbed. Her words choked. "Then let me die. It is better than this. I am a prisoner." "A prisoner," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft level. He knelt in front of her. "The women, they are prisoners. Tashe is a prisoner of his hate. I am a prisoner." He touched the small scar on his cheek. "White eyes," he said. "Soldiers. They came. My father, my brother. Gone. They take our land. They take our sky. They take our lives." He looked at her, and his eyes were not full of hate. They were full of pain so deep it mirrored her own. "I am a prisoner," he repeated, his voice thick. "I am a warrior of a dying people. I am taught to hate you. I am taught to kill you." He paused, his breath ragged. "And now, I am your husband. I must protect you from my people. I must protect you from your people. I must protect you from myself." Clara stopped crying. She just stared at him. The savage was gone. The devil was gone. In front of her was a young man, not much older than her, who was trapped, just as she was. His duty trapped him by his honor, by a world that was trying to erase him. He had saved her. He had married her to protect her. He had fought for her. He had chased her into a sandstorm to save her from a snake. He was not a monster. He was a man. And that, Clara realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. If he was a man, what did that make her? What did these new, confusing feelings in her chest mean? He stood up, the momentary connection broken. He went to his side of the teepee. He picked up his blanket. But he did not sit by the door. He walked to her pile of robes. He laid his thin blanket down, next to hers, but with a respectable space of at least 3 feet between them. He lay down, his back to her, and the message was clear. The guard duty was over. She was not a prisoner to be watched. She was a woman who slept nearby. He left a small, sharp skinning knife on the ground between them, within her reach. A gesture of trust, a weapon for her to use, for protection. Clara looked at the knife, then she looked at his back. She felt a wave of guilt so profound it made her dizzy. Guilt for her family, guilt for her faith, guilt for the small, traitorous part of her that was relieved he was no longer sitting by the door. She lay down on her own robes, her body aching, her mind at war. She did not touch the knife. She just watched the fire die, and for the first time, she did not pray for escape. She did not know what to pray for. The world, for a time, was reduced to the space of that small teepee. The fight with Tache and the failed, foolish escape into the sandstorm had changed the air. The nights were different. Kian no longer sat by the door as a guard. He now slept, as he had that first night of the new arrangement, on his own robes, a chaste but undeniable 3 feet of space away. The knife he had left between them was still there. Clara had pushed it to the side, a silent acknowledgement. She would not use it, and they both knew she would not run again. She could not. There was nowhere to run. But while the village had become her prison, the white world she had left was still moving, its gears grinding with ambition and steel. In Purgatory Bend, Captain Elijah Briggs was performing. He sat in the dusty saloon, a glass of warm whiskey in his hand, his clean blue uniform a stark contrast to the grime of the frontiersmen around him. He was speaking to a thin, nervous man with an ink-stained vest, a newspaper reporter from a town 50 miles east. "It is a tragedy, sir," Briggs said, his voice resonant with cultivated empathy. "A pure, innocent girl, Miss Clara Reed, stolen from the arms of her loving family. It is an act of barbarism that cannot be borne. I have just come from the family." He paused, lowering his eyes as if in quiet respect. Her poor mother, a woman of God, her father, a veteran, was heartbroken. Her brother, wounded in the attack. They are devastated. "And what will the army do, Captain?" the reporter asked, his pencil scratching on his pad. Briggs looked up, his blue eyes hard and clear. "We will do our sacred duty, sir. I have given my word to Thomas Reed. We will bring his daughter home, or we will avenge her." The men in the saloon, farmers and drifters, grunted in approval. This was a language they understood. Briggs raised his glass. "The Comanche have misjudged us. They have mistaken civilization's patience for weakness. They are about to learn the price of that error." He finished his whiskey and left the saloon to a murmur of admiring, angry voices. He walked, not to the telegraph office, but into the dark, foul-smelling alley between the saloon and the smithy. A man was waiting in the shadows, smoking a cheap cigar. It was the thick, bearded man who had aimed his rifle at Clara. "You play a fine part, Captain," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "It is not a part, Slade," Briggs said, his voice now stripped of all empathy. It was cold, flat, and sharp. "It is a narrative, and you, I trust, are ready to play yours." Slade spat the cigar butt onto the ground. "My men are ready, but your narrative almost got us killed. You said the Reed boy would be easy. He was not. You said the girl was all that mattered. We almost shot her by mistake when she saw us." "Your men are clumsy," Briggs snapped. "I hired you because you were supposed to be the best at starting a fire. You were not supposed to be seen." "They were seen by the girl," Slade said. "And what about the Reed boy? He saw us too, right before he went down. He lives. He can talk." Briggs smiled, a thin, unpleasant smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course he lives. That is the beauty of it. A wounded brother, a captured sister. It is a story that writes itself. It screams for retribution. A massacre where only the savages are left standing. And the girl is taken. That is a justification. That is a casus belli." Slade was not a man for Latin. He just frowned. "We get paid, right?" the railroad men said. "The railroad men will pay you," Briggs said, his voice soothing now. "And you will get your land, acres and acres of it, once I have cleared the territory, which I can only do after I have responded to this heinous attack, an attack that you so artfully provoked." He stepped closer, his face inches from the bigger man's. "In 3 days, we will ride. We will follow their trail. We are going to rescue Miss Clara Reed. And when we find the camp, Slade, I want no survivors. None. Not the warriors. Not the women. Not the children." "And the girl?" Slade asked. Briggs's smile returned. "If she is alive, we will save her. A grieving, traumatized heroine. If she is damaged or dead, then she is a martyr. Either way, I win. The land is cleared. Just make sure," he added, tapping Slade on the chest, "that when the smoke clears, the only story left to be told is mine." At the Reed homestead, there was no narrative. There was only a suffocating, hollow silence. Mary Reed had not stopped praying, her rosary beads clicking in the dark of the small house. Jacob, his arm in a sling, his shoulder a mass of purple bruises, sat on the porch step, cleaning his rifle with jerky, angry movements. He was consumed by a desire for a single thing: revenge. "Pa," Jacob said, his voice tight, "when Briggs goes, we go. I am going to kill the one who took her. I am going to kill all of them." Thomas Reed was not listening. He sat in his chair, the one he had built with his own hands, and stared at the western horizon, as if he could make his daughter appear. He had been there since Briggs had left, since the captain had offered his oily, practiced condolences. He did not trust Briggs. He had fought in a war. He knew men like Briggs, men who saw other human beings as rungs on a ladder. And he had a secret, a terrible, confusing secret that was eating him alive. The newspapers, the ones the reporter had, were already calling it the Cimarron Massacre. They said the Comanche had ripped Clara from her horse. But Thomas knew what he had seen. He had heard the shots and rode like a madman. He had seen the chaos, the smoke. He had seen Clara. She was not on her horse. Patience was rearing, and Clara fell. She had fallen, right in the path of the stampeding herd. He had seen it. His heart had stopped. She was on the ground. She was going to be crushed. And the warrior, the young one, the one on the pinto, he had not been the one to knock her down. He had been riding past. He had seen her. He had reined in his horse, a miracle of riding, and he had leaned down. A single, fluid motion. He had grabbed her, lifted her, pulled her from the path of the hooves, and hauled her onto his own horse. He had not scalped her. He had not lanced her. He had. Thomas admitted to the deepest, darkest part of his own soul he had saved her life. Then he had stolen it. The contradiction was a physical sickness. He wanted his daughter back. He would kill any man who stood in his way. But he could not shake the image. The man who stole her was the same man who had saved her from certain death. "Pa," Jacob said again, louder. "Did you hear me? We ride with Briggs." Thomas Reed slowly turned his head. He looked at his son, at the simple, pure hatred in his eyes. "He pulled her up." "Jacob," Thomas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What?" Jacob said, stopping his cleaning. "She was on the ground, the cattle they were going to, and he pulled her up. He saved her." "He is a red devil," Jacob spat. "He stole her. He took her. Pa, you know what they are doing to her. We have to get her back. We have to kill him." "I know what I saw," Thomas said, his voice flat. He turned back to the horizon. He wanted Clara back, more than he wanted his next breath. But he had a terrible, sinking feeling that riding with Captain Briggs was not the way. He felt deep in his bones that Briggs did not want to rescue Clara. He wanted to cleanse the land. And Thomas feared, with a father's dread, that his daughter was just a bullet in the captain's gun. In the village, Clara was unaware of the forces plotting her rescue. She was only aware of the rhythm of the day. The fight with Tasha and her failed escape had broken a strange kind of ice. The women, seeing her return, seeing Kian's open protection of her, had changed. The open hatred had faded. She was Kian's wife, and she was here. She had not died. She had not been set free. She was, by their law, one of them. And so they began to teach her. It was not gentle. An old woman, her face a web of 1,000 wrinkles, watched Clara try to scrape a deer hide. Clara, using the scraping tool as she would a hoe, was tearing the valuable skin. The old woman let out a sound of pure disgust. She snatched the tool from Clara's hand. "No!" she barked. She grabbed Clara's hands, which were soft and white next to her own brown, scarred ones, and placed them correctly on the tool. She showed her the angle, the short, sharp, downward strokes. Clara tried. She was clumsy, weak. Her muscles screamed, but she did not stop. She worked until her hands were blistered and bleeding. The old woman watched, and at the end of the day, she gave a single, curt nod. It felt, to Clara, like the highest praise she had ever received. She learned to find the right wood, the kind that would burn with little smoke. She learned to mend Kian's moccasins with an awl and sinew, her stitches clumsy and large next to the fine work of the Comanche women. One afternoon, she was helping a group of women grind corn. They sat in a circle, their heavy pestles rising and falling in a shared, perfect rhythm. Thump-dump, thump-dump. Clara tried to join. Her rhythm was off. She was too fast, then too slow. She lifted when she should have dropped. The heavy stone pestle went sideways, striking the lip of the log, sending a white puff of cornmeal into her face. She froze, expecting the women to be angry. She had interrupted the rhythm. She had wasted the food. She sputtered, a cloud of fine white powder escaping her lips, her eyelashes and hair coated in it. The women stopped. They stared at her. And then, one of them, the young mother with the baby who had once spat at her feet, let out a single, short giggle. Another woman covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. And then, like a dam breaking, they were laughing. It was not a cruel laugh. It was a full, rich, surprised sound. They were laughing with her, at the absurdity of her, this pale, clumsy bird in their midst, covered in their food. Clara stood there for a moment, stunned, and then a strange, rusty sound came from her own throat. She was laughing, too, a shaky, tear-filled laugh. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. It was the first time she had felt like a person. The change was slow, but it was real. A few days later, the hunters returned. The drums had been beating since noon, a fast, excited pulse. They had found a herd of buffalo, the last of the season. That night, the village celebrated. Great fires were lit. The smell of roasting meat, a smell of bounty and joy, filled the air. The drums were no longer a single heartbeat. They were a thunderous, rolling pulse. Clara sat on the edge of the circle, an observer. She was not expected to join, but she was no longer hidden away. And then the warriors began to dance. They wore the paint and the regalia of their fathers. They moved in a line, their bodies weaving, their feet stomping the earth in time with the drums. They were reenacting the hunt. They were honoring the buffalo spirits. Clara searched for one face. She found him, Kian. He was not the silent man who slept by her door. He was not the awkward boy who had given her a dead flower. He was a warrior. His skin, oiled and gleaming in the firelight, was painted with symbols she did not understand. He wore a breechcloth and moccasins, his muscles moving with a fluid power that made her stop breathing. He was beautiful. It was a word she had never associated with a man, not with her father or her brother or the clumsy boys in Purgatory Bend. But Kian was beautiful. He was strong, and he was graceful, and he was completely, utterly free. He was a part of the wind, and the fire, and the earth he stomped on. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, matching beat to the drums, thump-dump, thump-dump. And it was not fear. She watched him, her eyes wide, for what felt like hours. She watched the turn of his head, the line of his jaw, the ripple of muscle in his back. She was fascinated, and she was terrified. The dance ended. The warriors broke, laughing, their bodies slick with sweat, moving to get food and water. Clara was still sitting, her mind a whirl, when a small, naked child, running in a game, crashed into her. The boy bounced off, laughing, but the impact threw her off balance. She was sitting on a low log near one of the fires. She stumbled, falling forward, her hand shooting out to catch herself. She was falling toward Kian, who had just turned from the circle, his chest heaving. Her hand landed flat on his arm, just above the elbow. His skin was not like hers. It was hot. It was damp with sweat, and the muscle beneath her palm was as hard as the canyon rock. A jolt, pure and white-hot, shot up her arm. It was not a shock of fear. It was a current of pure, undiluted life. It ran from her hand to her shoulder, down her spine, and settled deep in her belly, a warm, heavy, pooling sensation that made her gasp. She snatched her hand back as if the fire itself had burned her. He had frozen. He did not move. He just looked at her. His eyes, in the flickering light, were dark and bottomless. He had felt it too. He had felt the jolt. He did not smile. He did not frown. He just looked at her. A look so intense it felt as if he was seeing not just her face, but the sudden, guilty, terrified pulse in her veins. Clara's face was a sheet of flame. She could not breathe. She turned, without a word, and fled. She ran to the darkness of the teepee, her body shaking, her mind screaming. She lay on her robes for hours, her back to the entrance. She was a virgin. She was a good Christian woman. She had been taught her whole life that her body was a temple, a quiet, holy place. She had been taught that the feelings of the flesh were a sin, a weakness, a thing to be prayed away. She had never, not once, known that her body could do that a simple touch, an accidental brush of skin, could feel like a lightning strike. She could hear him, much later, as he finally entered the teepee. He was quiet, but she was hyper-aware of him. She heard the soft sound of his moccasins on the dirt. She heard the rustle of his blanket. He lay down on his robes. The 3 feet of space between them had, until tonight, felt like a mile. Now, it felt like nothing. It felt as thin as a piece of paper. The air in the teepee was thick, charged, electric. She was lying there, her eyes squeezed shut, thinking about her captor, thinking about the heathen who had married her, thinking about his arm, about the heat of his skin, about the way the firelight had danced on his shoulders. She realized with a cold, piercing horror, thinking about him in a way that she should not. She was, in the privacy of her own heart, discovering a desire she never knew, a desire that was forbidden, wrong, and more powerful than anything she had ever felt. A few nights later, the tension in the camp was thick. The celebration was over. Scouts had returned, their faces grim. They had seen something. Soldiers, far off, but moving. The village was quiet. The fires kept low. Clara and Kian sat outside their teepee, not speaking. The silence that had once been empty, then awkward, was now full. It was full of the unspoken jolt of the accidental touch. Clara, desperate to break the spell, to return to something normal, looked up at the stars. She wanted to ask him about his life, about the world before her. Kian, she said, her voice small. Your family. She pointed at him, then at the ground. Before this. He was silent for a long time. He did not look at her. He looked out at the dark ridges, the same ridges where his scouts were watching. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, and the English words were heavy, as if they cost him something. They are gone, he said. He picked up a small stone, weighing it in his hand. Soldiers, men like Briggs, they take the land. They take the buffalo. They take life. He looked at her then, his eyes dark, and in them she saw not hate, but a pain that was as deep and as old as the rocks around them. Many, he said, the word catching in his throat. Many were taken from us. 2. The 2 hung in the air, a bridge of shared sorrow. He was not just her captor. She was not just his prisoner. They were, she realized, just 2 people, sitting in the dark, in a world that was trying to kill them both. The night before the attack, the air in the village was wrong. The tension that had been a thin, high wire of unease had become a heavy, suffocating blanket. The scouts had not returned, and the drums were silent. Kian did not sleep. He sat, fully dressed, in the teepee, his rifle across his knees. Clara, sensing his tension, was also awake, her body a coiled spring of dread. The 3 feet of space between their sleeping robes felt, once again, like an impassable canyon. Dawn came not with the gentle graying of the sky, but with a rip in the fabric of the world. It began with a sound Clara had never heard, a high, whistling shriek that was not human and not animal. It was a cavalry bugle. The sound was followed, an instant later, by a rolling thunder that was not the sky. It was the sound of 1,000 hooves. "Tar!" Kian hissed. The word was a breath, a curse. Soldiers. He was on his feet before the first scream. He grabbed Clara by the arm, his grip bruising, and hauled her from her sleeping robe. He dragged her out of the teepee into the gray, misty light, which was already being torn apart by flashes of orange gunfire. "Here, no move," he commanded. He shoved her, hard, behind a low, thick earthen wall, a windbreak the women had built to protect their drying racks. "No move. Clara, you understand, Hyde." His eyes were not the eyes of the man who had given her a flower. They were the eyes of the warrior from the ridge. They were cold, hard, and utterly alive with a terrible, focused energy. He was gone, a shadow with a rifle, disappearing into the chaos. The village erupted. Teepee flaps were thrown open, and people, half-dressed and blind with sleep, stumbled out into a nightmare. Gunfire. It was not the single crack of a hunting rifle. It was a volley, 12, 2 dozen, rifles firing at once, a continuous, deafening roar, and with it, the screams, men shouting orders, women shrieking, children wailing in pure, high-pitched terror. Clara huddled behind the wall, her hands over her ears, her body shaking so violently she thought her bones would break. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying, "God, make it stop. Father, please, make it stop." But it did not stop. The smell of gun smoke, thick and sulphurous, filled her lungs. It was worse than the ambush. This was not a raid. This was an extermination. She saw the young woman who had laughed with her at the corn grinding. The woman ran from her teepee, her hair flying, her face a mask of panic. A puff of dust and blood erupted from her back. She did not make a sound. She just fell, like a puppet with its strings cut. Clara's stomach heaved, and she was sick in the dust. "Hide," Kian had said. "Stay." But she could not. She heard a sound, a whimpering, right beside her. A child, a little boy of perhaps 4, was crouched near the wall, his hands over his face, his small body frozen. He was the child she had seen Kian teaching to use a small, toy bow. And then she saw the women, the old woman who had taught her to scrape hides, the young mother who had spat at her. They were huddled, a group of 20 or more, with their children, behind the chief's great teepee, trying to get away from the first line of fire. They were her family, her mother, her father, in the barn, hiding from a threat they could not fight. The memory was so vivid, so powerful, it eclipsed her fear. She saw her own mother's terrified face in the faces of these women. She could not hide. She would not hide. This was her choice. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees to the little boy. He shrieked when she touched him. "Shh," she said, her voice a ragged sound. "Shh, we will go to our mother." She scooped him up, his small body rigid with terror, and half ran, half crawled, staying low, toward the huddled group of women. She pushed the boy into the arms of the nearest woman, who stared at her, her eyes wide with incomprehension. The battle was pure, unadulterated chaos. Kian and the other warriors had formed a desperate, moving line. They were using the horses, the teepees, anything for cover. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. They had old rifles, some bows and lances. They were fighting against new, repeating rifles. They were dying where they stood, but they were not running. They were buying time. They were selling their lives so the women and children could find a way out. The attackers were not just soldiers. Through the smoke, Clara saw them. The blue cavalry uniforms of Briggs's men were on one flank, but on the other, charging through the teepees, setting them on fire, were the volunteers. Slade's men. They were not soldiers. They were a mob, screaming, their faces contorted, firing at anything that moved. This was the clearing of the land. This was Briggs's order. Among that mob, his face a sickly gray, his rifle held but not fired, was Thomas Reed. He had ridden with them, his heart a cold lump of ice. Jacob, his arm still in a sling, rode beside him, his face a mask of righteous fury. Thomas had told himself he was here to save Clara. He was here to find her. And then the bugle had sounded. No prisoners, he had heard Briggs shout to his own men. Fire at will! And to Slade, a quieter, more personal order. Clear the field. Every man, every child, cleanse it. Thomas had watched, frozen in horror. As the volunteers, men from his own town, men he had drunk beer with, had surged forward, their faces lit with a kind of holy, bloodthirsty madness. He saw Slade, the bearded man, shoot an old man who was hobbling, unarmed, from a teepee. Fire! Pa! Jacob had screamed, his own rifle blazing. For Clara! But Thomas's conscience, the one he had lived with since the war, had finally, fully, woken up. This was not a rescue. This was not justice. This was a massacre. He was on the wrong side. He had brought his son, his wounded son, to a murder. His stomach churned, and he knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that he had become a part of the evil he had tried to escape. God forgive me, he whispered, his hands shaking. He was looking for one face. Not a warrior, not Briggs. He was looking for Clara. He was looking for a ghost. And then he saw her. The battle had shifted. The Comanche warriors were falling back to a dry creek bed, a last, hopeless line of defense. The women and children were exposed. A group of 3 volunteers, drunk on the killing, broke through the line. They saw the women. "Oh, looky here," one yelled. "Fresh prizes!" They surged toward the huddling group, their rifles raised. Clara, who had just pushed the little boy to safety, was standing between the women and the approaching men. "No!" she screamed, her voice a thin, useless sound. A little girl, the daughter of the woman who had laughed, broke free from her mother's grasp. She was petrified. She ran, not away from the men, but directly into the open, into the center of the firing line. "Tassina!" the mother screamed. The girl stood, frozen, the dust kicking up around her feet from stray bullets. Clara did not think. She did not hesitate. She ran. She ran, her deerskin dress flying, her uncombed hair streaming, and she grabbed the little girl, Tassina, pulling her up. "Clara, no." It was her father's voice. Thomas saw it all. He saw his daughter, his child, running into the bullets. "Shoot him!" one of the volunteers yelled, leveling his rifle at Clara and the child. "Shoot the squaw!" Keon saw it, too, from the creek bed. He watched as the white woman, his wife, the woman who had tried to flee him, threw her own body in front of a Comanche child. His heart, which was cold with the certainty of his own death, suddenly broke open. A wave of fear, not for himself, but for her, so powerful it almost dropped him to his knees, washed over him. It was joined by a fierce, burning, impossible respect. He rose from his cover, firing his rifle, a desperate shot to draw their attention. "Pa, it's Clara!" Jacob screamed, his voice breaking. Thomas Reed's rifle was up. He was a dead shot. He fired. The volunteer who had called Clara a squaw, the one aiming at her, clutched his chest, his eyes wide with surprise. and fell. Thomas had made his choice. In that instant of stunned silence, Clara, clutching the child, looked up. She saw her father, his face a mask of agony, his rifle smoking. "Pa," she whispered. She looked to her left and saw Jacob, his face white with shock and a dawning, sick understanding. And she looked across the field and saw Kian, his face a mix of terror and pride, his rifle empty, a group of soldiers now turning on him. Thomas ran to her. He ran, his limp forgotten, and grabbed her, pulling her and the Comanche child into a desperate embrace. "Clara! Oh, God, Clara, you are alive!" He was crying, his tears cutting trails in the grime on his face. He held her at arm's length. He was shocked. This was not the girl he knew. She was in buckskin. Her skin was brown from the sun. Her hair was a wild tangle, but her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were blazing. They were the eyes of a warrior. "Pa," she choked out. "You have to stop them. They are killing children. They are killing my—" She did not know how to finish. "My friends. My family." The moment was shattered. Well, this is a touching reunion. Captain Elijah Briggs sat on his horse. Not 10 yards away. He had seen it all. He had seen Thomas Reed kill one of his volunteers. He had seen Clara Reed, the brutalized maiden, clinging to a savage child. His entire narrative was on fire. "Clara," he said, his voice a silken, venomous thing, "you have been through a terrible ordeal. We are here to rescue you." "Some rescue," Clara spat, her voice raw. She pushed the child behind her. "You are murdering them." Briggs' face went cold. "She is hysterical," he said to the soldiers who had gathered around him. "The trauma has added to her mind." He looked at Thomas. "And you, old man, firing on your own side. That is treason." "This is not a battle." "Briggs," Thomas said, his voice shaking, but his rifle steady, pointed at the captain's chest. "This is a slaughter, and you are a liar." Briggs smiled. His plan was ruined, but he was a man who knew how to cut his losses. He saw Slade, his bearded henchman, moving through the smoke, his eyes on the girl. Briggs gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Resolve it." Clara saw the movement. Slade, his rifle coming up, was not aiming at her father. He was aiming past her. She turned. Kian was running toward them, a knife in his hand. He had seen the soldiers surround her. He had seen Briggs. He was going to die with her. "Kian, no!" she screamed. A shot rang out, sharp and close. Kian grunted, stumbling. A red line appeared on his arm, a grazing bullet. He did not fall, but he was slowed. Slade was reloading, his face a mask of concentration, aiming for the killing shot. Jacob, who had been frozen, finally moved. He screamed, a wordless sound of rage, and charged his horse at Slade, knocking the man's rifle aside. In that single chaotic second, 3 things happened at once. Briggs, seeing his plan fall apart, raised his own pistol to shoot Thomas. Thomas, his rifle already up, saw the motion. Clara saw Kian, wounded, staggering, but still trying to reach her. "Run!" Thomas Reed roared at his daughter. He did not fire at Briggs. He fired at the sky, at the soldiers, at anything, his rifle cracking, a wall of sound and smoke. "Run! Clara, I will hold them. Get him. Go run!" It was a choice, a father's final, desperate, split-second choice. He was not saving his daughter from the Comanche. He was saving his daughter with him. He was buying them their life. Kian, understanding, grabbed Clara's arm. "He is right. We go, now." "No, I will not leave him, Pa," she screamed, pulling against him. "He stays for you," Kian yelled, his voice raw. "You die. He dies for nothing. Come." He pulled her, and this time she went, her heart ripping in two. She scrambled onto a loose pony. Kian vaulting up behind her, his wounded arm dripping blood onto her shoulder. She looked back, one last time. The village was an inferno. The teepees were blazing. The air was black with smoke. And she saw her father, Thomas Reed, a veteran of one war, standing his ground in another. He was standing beside his son, Jacob. They were back to back, their rifles barking, no longer fighting with the soldiers, but fighting against them, holding them back, creating the few precious seconds their daughter needed. Kian kicked the pony, and the animal leaped forward, into the smoke, away from the battle. Clara did not look back again. She could not, she just rode, her face buried in Kian's back, the sound of her father's rifle, the last terrible sound of her old world, echoing in her ears as her new world burned to ash behind her. The pony was a good one, fast and sure-footed, but it was lathered and failing. Kian drove it mercilessly, up into the high, broken country, a maze of stone and shadow. Clara clung to him, her face pressed against the buckskin of his back, the warm, metallic smell of his blood filling her senses. She did not know how long they rode. An hour, a lifetime. The gunshots had faded, replaced by the rising shriek of the wind. The sky, which had been a clear, pale gray at dawn, was now a bruised, churning purple. The sun was gone, swallowed by a wall of black clouds that was racing toward them from the west. "Kian," Clara said, her voice a dry rasp. "Your arm." The sleeve of his shirt was soaked, a dark, glistening red. He had been holding the reins with his good hand, his wounded arm clutched tight to his chest. He did not answer. He just urged the horse up a steep, treacherous game trail. The pony stumbled. It recovered, its sides heaving, but its strength was gone. Kian reined it in, sliding from its back. He almost fell, his legs buckling. Clara was off in an instant, her body a single, throbbing ache. She ran to him as he leaned against the horse's flank, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "We must go," he said, his voice thick, slurring. He had lost more blood than she thought. "You cannot ride," she stated. It was not an argument. It was a fact. "We must," he insisted, pushing himself away from the horse. He staggered, and she caught him. He was heavy, a dead, solid weight. She, who had struggled to lift water skins, was now holding up a warrior. "Where?" she pleaded, the wind tearing at her hair. "Look at the sky. Where can we go?" He looked up, his dark eyes squinting against the first cold drops of rain. "There!" he gasped, pointing. She saw it, a dark slash in the rock face. 50 yards up, a shallow cave, barely a hollow. "No," she said. "The horse. We cannot leave." Kian slapped the pony's rump, a hard, final sound. "It will go. It will find its own way. We will not go." It took them an eternity. He leaned on her, and she wrapped his good arm around her shoulder, her own arm circling his waist. They were a single, wounded, lurching creature, two people bound by blood and desperation. He stumbled. She held him. She slipped on the wet rock. He found his footing and kept her from falling. The sky broke open as they reached the mouth of the cave. It was not just rain. It was a deluge, a solid, driving sheet of water that turned the world to a gray blur, a clap of thunder, so loud it felt like the rock itself was splitting, echoed around them. They collapsed inside. The cave was not deep, perhaps 15 feet. It was dry, and the floor was covered in sand and the debris of old pack rat nests. It smelled of dust and stone. Kian slid down the back wall, his legs giving out. He sat in the sand, his head thrown back, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow, his face a waxy, terrifying color. Clara stood for a single, frozen second. She was a captive. He was a savage. He was her enemy. He was also the only person who had defended her. He was the man who had slept by her door, He was the man her father had, in his last, desperate act, told her to run with. He was going to die, here, in this cave, while she watched. "No," she whispered. The word was an oath. "Kian," she said, her voice sharp. "The arm? Let me see. Now." He did not open his eyes. She did not wait for permission. She went to him, her hands, which had been shaking with fear, suddenly steady. She ripped open the saturated, bloody sleeve of his shirt. The wound was ugly. The bullet had torn a long, jagged furrow along the outside of his upper arm. From his shoulder to his elbow, it was not a clean hole, but a terrible, deep gash. It was bleeding, a steady, dark ooze, and the skin around it was already swelling. "Water," she said, her voice now a command. She fumbled for the small water skin he had tied to his belt. It was still there. She uncorked it with her teeth and poured the clean, precious water over the wound. He hissed, a long, sharp sound, his body tensing, but he did not stop her. She needed to clean it. She needed bandages. She had nothing. She looked down at her deerskin dress. The old woman had taught her to sew it. It was her only garment. She took the small knife from the sheath at her waist, the one he had given her for protection, the one she had never touched. She grabbed the hem of her dress, and with a strong, ragged pull, she tore a long, thick strip from the bottom. She tore another and another, until her dress was a tattered thing, ending at her knees. She worked. She had helped her mother bind her father's wounds from the farm. She knew what to do. She washed the grit and the gunpowder from the gash, her touch surprisingly gentle. He winced, his muscles bunching, but he let her. Her hands were covered in his blood. They were covered in her sweat, and they were covered in the rain that dripped from her own saturated hair. She began to pray, the words a low, frantic murmur. "Our Father, who art in heaven, give us this day, forgive us." "It is not deep," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "It missed the bone." "Be quiet," she ordered, her voice trembling. "Do not speak. Save your strength." She finished cleaning it. She took a clean strip of the deerskin, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it hard against the bleeding. "Hold this," she said, pressing his good hand to the wound. She took the other strips and began to wind them, tight and sure, around his arm, binding the pad in place. Her movements were efficient, economical. She was not the clumsy girl who had spilled the corn. She was a woman with a purpose. When she was done, his arm was bound. The bleeding slowed. She sat back on her heels, her strength gone, the adrenaline draining, leaving her hollow and cold. Outside, the storm was a living thing. The wind howled like 1,000 grieving women. Thunder cracked, and lightning, in great, white-hot flashes, lit the cave, casting their shadows, huge and distorted, against the stone wall. They were soaked. The air in the cave was clammy and cold. Kian was shivering, a deep, racking tremor. It was not just the cold. It was the blood loss. Fire. They needed fire. Clara looked around. The cave was bare rock, but Kian was a warrior. He was never without. She fumbled at the pouch on his belt, her hands finding a small, leather-wrapped bundle. Inside, wrapped in dry skin, was a flint, a piece of steel, and a small puff of tinder. She gathered the driest bits of debris she could find, the old, desiccated nests of the rats. She struck the steel, a spark, another. The tinder caught. She blew, gently, her own breath giving it life. A small, fragile, wonderful flame. She fed it tiny twigs, then larger ones. A small, smokeless fire, like the ones the women built, began to crackle in the center of the cave. It was a miracle. She moved him, half dragging, half cajoling, closer to the warmth. She sat beside him, pulling her own knees to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, and she began to shake. Two. They were alive. They were two people in a cave, while the world tried to tear itself apart outside. The forced husband was gone. The prisoner's wife was gone. All that was left was a man and a woman. "You should not have," he said, his voice stronger now, the fire's warmth bringing some color back to his face. "In the village, the child. She was Clara did not know how to explain it. "I could not let them." "You are a fool," he said. It was not an insult. "You would have died, for one of us." "And you," she suddenly flared, the anger, the grief, the terror of the day finally boiling over. "You came running at them with a knife against rifles. You are a fool." "I am a warrior," he said, as if that explained everything. "You are a man who was getting himself killed," she cried, the tears she had not shed for her father, for the village, now coming, hot and furious. "And why? Why did you do any of it? Why did you take me? Why did you marry me? You dragged me into this war. My father, my brother, they are." She could not finish. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Kian was silent for a long time. The only sound was the fire, and the storm, and her own broken sobs. "When I took you," he finally said, his voice low and heavy, "I saw the men, the white men, the ones who fired on you." Clara's head snapped up. "You saw them." "I saw them," he said. "I saw them shoot the man with you. I saw them shoot at you. I knew what they were. Volunteers, men who kill for sport, men who kill women. I was not stealing you, Clara. I was saving you." She stared at him, her mind reeling. "And in the village," he continued, his gaze fixed on the small fire. "Tashe, the others, you were a prize. You know what that means. They would say, he could not say the word. They would have shared you. They would have used you until you were broken, and then sold you, or killed you." He looked at her, his eyes dark with the shame of his own people's cruelty. "Marriage was the only way, the only law, my law. I made you mine so no other man could touch you." He looked away. "It was the only protection I could give you." The truth of it, the simple, terrible, honorable truth, hit her. He had not trapped her. He had built her a cage to keep the real monsters out. "And me," he said, his voice almost too low to hear. "I hate it. I hate your people. I hate the blue coats. I hate the men who take our land. I am taught to hate." "I hated you," she whispered, the confession torn from her. "When you took me, I prayed for you to die. I prayed for you to be damned." "I know," he'd said. "And in the village," she continued, the words tumbling out. "When Tash and when I ran, I was so afraid of you, of this." She gestured to the space between them. "I know," he said again, his voice thick. "But today," she said, her voice dropping. "Today, when that man shot at you, when I saw you get hit, She looked at him, and the last of her old world fell away. "I was not afraid of you anymore. Kian, I was afraid for you. I thought he had killed you, and the thought of you gone, of you not being—" She stopped. "It was the most terrifying feeling I have ever had." He turned his head, his dark, intense gaze meeting hers. The air in the cave, thick with smoke and rain, was suddenly charged, electric, still. He had been holding his own confession. He had been holding it for weeks. "I did not want this," he whispered. "A white wife. It is a tragedy. It is death. It is a thing that cannot be. My people, your people. There is no place for us." He looked down at his own hand, the one she had bound. "I tried," he said. "I tried to hate you. You are white. You are the enemy. But I watched you. I watched you with the children. I watched you try to learn. I watched you laugh." He looked up, and his eyes were full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she had never seen. "I saw you at the fire, when you danced, and in my heart it became a soft thing." He had tried not to love her, and he had failed. And she, who had been taught to fear her own body, who had been taught that desire was a sin, she knew, in that single, shattering moment, that she had failed, too. Neither of them moved. The fire crackled. The storm raged. And then, slowly, with a hesitation that was almost painful, he reached out his good hand. He did not grab, he did not take it, he just offered it, his palm up. Clara looked at his hand, the hand of a warrior, the hand of her captor, the hand of the man who had just confessed his heart. She uncurled her own, her hand, pale and small, stained with his blood, and she placed it in his fingers closed around hers, his skin warm, calloused, real. He did not pull her, he did not command, he just held her. And it was, Clara realized, the first truly voluntary choice she had made since she had run to save the child. She moved. She slid the 2 feet of space across the sandy floor until she was kneeling in front of him. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. Clara did not know who moved first. Maybe they both did. She leaned in. He leaned forward. His lips were not like she had imagined. They were not cruel. They were not demanding. They were chapped and warm, and they tasted faintly of salt, rain, and smoke. It was a kiss, her first. It was hesitant and chaste, and it lasted only a second. She pulled back. He pulled back. They stared at each other, their breath mingling in the cold air. And then she did it, with her own choice. She leaned in again, and this time she put her free hand on his face, on the strong line of his jaw. This kiss was not hesitant. This was the jolt from the fire. This was the thunder from the storm. This was the answer to the question she had been too afraid to ask. He responded, his good arm coming around her, pulling her close, not with force, but with a deep, shuddering need. His mouth opened against hers, and it was not a gentle exploration. It was a discovery. It was a claim. Clara, a virgin, a girl of God, a daughter of a puritanical world, felt something inside her uncoil. A hot, liquid, powerful thing. It was not sin. Her mother had been wrong. This was not a thing to be feared. This was not a thing to be ashamed of. This was life. This was a yes in a world of no. This was gratitude. This was the warmth of the fire against the cold of the storm. This was her body, her own body, responding to his with a logic that was older and truer than any sermon. He laid her back on the buffalo robes, his own body covering hers, shielding her from the cold. His mouth left hers, trailing a line of fire down her jaw, to her throat. She arched her back, a small, involuntary sound escaping her. She was discovering a desire she never knew, a desire for him, to be closer, to be one. The fire in the center of the cave, untended, began to die. The roaring flames that had lit their confessions gave way to a pile of deep, glowing, red-hot embers. Outside, the worst of the storm had passed. The crashes of thunder were now a distant, low rumble. The wind had ceased its howling, and all that was left was the gentle, steady sound of the rain. Their breathing, which had been ragged and harsh, slowed. It deepened. It found a new rhythm. We found each other. In the small, dry cave, protected from the ruins of their 2 worlds, the night closed over them. It was not a marriage of capture. It was not a marriage of law. It was, at last, a marriage of choice. The first gray light of dawn was filtering into the cave when Clara awoke. The rain had stopped. The air was cold, clean, and new. She was warm. She was wrapped in Kian's arms, his body curled around hers, their legs tangled, the buffalo robes covering them both. His wounded arm was resting, carefully, on her hip. He was asleep, his breathing deep and even, his face in the soft light, stripped of all its hardness. He looked young. He looked peaceful. She looked at the careful bandage she had tied. It was held. She lay there, not moving, for a long time. She was not the same person. The girl who had ridden out to check on cattle, the girl who had dreamed of Boston, was gone. She had been burned away in the fire of the village and washed clean by the storm. In her place was this new person, this woman. She felt a profound, aching tenderness for the man who slept beside her. It was a feeling so powerful, so deep, it scared her more than the battle. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she reached up and brushed a stray lock of black hair from his forehead. His skin was warm. She was his, he was hers. She knew with a deep, bone-felt certainty that her heart and her body were now bound to this warrior. And she knew, as she watched the new day fill the mouth of the cave, that she would follow him, not as a captive, but as a wife. She would follow him into whatever new, uncertain, and dangerous world was waiting for them. The journey from the cave was a slow, painful pilgrimage. The world was washed clean, but it was a landscape of grief. Kian's arm was stiff and throbbing, and Clara, though rested, was weak with a hunger that was now a gnawing ache. They found the pony, grazing in a small patch of green, its loyalty a small, dumb miracle in a world of betrayal. They rode double, Kian's good arm around Clara's waist, her body a shield against the wind. He was too weak to lead, so she held the reins, guiding the pony, though she had no idea where she was going. "Where are they?" she asked him, her voice a whisper against the wind. "The others, the survivors." "A place," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "A place of last things. South. Follow the water." For 2 days, they followed the small, muddy creek that had been born from the storm. They had nothing to eat. On the second afternoon, Kian, his face a pale, waxy mask, slid from the horse. He took his bow, his movement stiff. He was gone for an hour that felt like a year to Clara. She sat alone in the vast, empty landscape and realized she was not afraid he had abandoned her. She was afraid he had died. He returned, a single scrawny rabbit dangling from his hand. He had killed it with a rock. He was too weak to draw his bow. They cooked it that night, a small, desperate fire. The meat was tough and not enough, but it was life. They shared it, their hands brushing in the firelight. On the third day, they found them in a deep, hidden arroyo. A place the cavalry would never find unless they were led there, was a small, smoldering fire, the survivors. It was not a village. It was a handful of ghosts. There were maybe 15 of them. The old woman who had taught Clara to scrape hides was there, her face a mask of silent, bottomless grief. The young mother who had laughed, the one whose daughter, Tassina, was now an orphan. Tassina was there, her eyes huge and empty, her hand clutching the skirt of the old woman, and the old chief, his white hair stained with dirt, was lying on a single buffalo robe, his chest bound. He had been shot, and his breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. The scarred warrior, the one who had hated Clara, was nowhere to be seen. He had died in the creek bed. The women looked up as Kian and Clara slid from the pony. There were no cries of welcome. There was only a low, keening moan from the young mother. She saw Kian, her leader, alive, and she saw the white woman, the cause of it all, still with him. But the hatred was gone. It had been burned out, leaving only ash. Clara went, not to Kian, but to the child. She knelt in front of Tassina. The girl stared at her. Clara held out her hand. The girl did not move. Clara reached into the pouch at her own waist, where she had saved a single, small piece of the cooked rabbit. She held it out. The child looked at the meat, then at Clara. She took it. It was an acceptance. It was a pardon. Kian, meanwhile, was kneeling at the side of the chief. He was speaking, his voice low, recounting the battle, the escape. The old man's eyes were closed, but he was listening. A scout returned later that day, a young boy who had been watching the roads. He carried a piece of paper, a news sheet he had stolen from a dead man's saddlebag. He could not read the words, but he knew they were about them. He gave it to Clara. Her hands shook as she unfolded the cheap, pulpy paper. It was the Eastern Telegraph from the town 50 miles away. The headline, in big, black letters, screamed, "Hero Captain Saves Maiden. Briggs Rescues Clara Reed from Savage Den." Her stomach turned. She read, her voice a hoarse, unbelieving whisper. She read Briggs's report. He was a hero. He had ridden into a den of vipers to rescue her. He had been ambushed by a horde of bloodthirsty savages. He and his brave volunteers had fought and, by the grace of God, had delivered the poor, traumatized girl, the report mentioned, as a footnote, that in the confusion of the battle. Her father, Thomas Reed, had been tragically lost, his mind addled by grief. Clara said, her voice choking. "He says I am saved. He says my father is lost. He says—" Kian, his face grim, took the paper from her. He did not need to read it. He understood. "He lies," Kian said. "He lies to get more soldiers. He lies to finish this." He gestured to the handful of survivors, to the dying chief. "He will hunt us. He will not stop until the remnants are gone." The old chief's eyes opened. He said one word, a weak, gurgling sound. Kian leaned in. The old man spoke, his last breath a whisper. And then, he was still. Kian stood. His face was a mask of grief. He said, "Do not run." He said, "Die as men, not as dogs." Kian looked at the 4 other warriors, boys of 16 and old men of 60. "We will not run," he said. "You cannot fight," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Look at you. You are wounded. They are children. It is not a fight. It is suicide." "It has an ending," Kian said, his voice flat. It was then that the scout, the one who had been posted on the ridge, let out a low whistle. A wagon, a single, slow farm wagon, was approaching the arroyo. It was not blue. It was not military. Kian and the other warriors raised their rifles, their hands unsteady. A voice, thick with weariness, called out, "Do not shoot. We come in peace. We are looking for our daughter." Clara's heart stopped. She knew that voice. "Pa!" she screamed. She ran up the rocky slope, out of the arroyo, into the sunlight. Thomas Reed was walking beside the wagon, his rifle held, barrel down, in his hand. Jacob was not with him, but 2 other men were farmers she had known her whole life, their faces grim, their own rifles in their hands. "Clara!" Thomas's voice broke. He saw her, the girl in the torn buckskin dress, her hair wild, her skin brown. He ran to her, his limp pronounced, and pulled her into his arms, crushing her. "I thought," he choked. "Briggs said you were lost. That I was lost. Jacob, my God, Clara, Jacob is—" "What?" Clara said, pulling back, a new, cold fear. "Where is Jacob?" "He is in town." Thomas looked ashamed. "He believes in Briggs. He believes the story. He thinks I went mad. He thinks they—" He gestured to the arroyo. "Killed you. He is not himself. Clara, he is raising a militia. He and Briggs. They are coming to wipe out the rest." "Pa," she said, her voice firm, pulling him toward the arroyo. "You have to see." Thomas and the 2 farmers followed, their rifles at the ready. They stepped into the hidden canyon. They saw the handful of survivors, the women, their faces hollow with grief, the children, their eyes empty, the dead chief lying on his robe. And they saw Kian, his arm in a crude sling, his rifle held, not in aggression, but in defense of his last few people. Thomas Reed stopped. He looked at Keon. He looked at the dying embers of the fire. He looked at his daughter. "I have come to take you home, Clara," he said, his voice heavy. Clara looked at her father, her eyes clear, and then she looked at Keon, who was watching her, his face a mask, braced for her to leave. She made her choice. She had made it in the cave. She walked away from her father and stood beside Keon. She took his good hand. "Pa," she said, her voice shaking, but clear as a bell. "I am with Keon. I have chosen. I am not being forced, not anymore." Thomas Reed stared. He looked at his daughter, at her hand, held fast in the hand of the warrior. He looked at the deerskin dress, the bare feet, the fire in her eyes. The devout, obedient girl he had raised was gone. In her place stood a woman he did not know, a woman he was, in that moment, profoundly proud of. He nodded, a single, painful acknowledgement. "I see." "They are coming, Pa," Clara said, her voice urgent. "Briggs and Jacob, they are coming to finish this, but they are coming based on a lie." "It does not matter," Keon said, his voice hard. "A lie or a truth. The bullets are the same." "No," Clara said, and the fire in her eyes was now ablaze. "No, it is the only thing that matters." She turned to Keon, to her father, to the small, huddled group. "We cannot run, and we cannot fight, so we must talk." "Talk," Keon said, as if the word was insane. "You," she said, pointing to her father, "you are a witness. You saw Briggs give the order. You saw Slade's men, and I am a witness. I am the rescued maiden. What if the maiden says she did not want to be rescued?" A plan, desperate and mad, was forming in her mind. "Pa," she said, "his militia. They are farmers. They are men from town. They are not murderers. They are like you. They have been lied to. They are here for me. He will kill us all before you speak a word." "Clara," Thomas said. "He will not," Clara said. "He will not. Not if I'm standing next to you. Not if I'm the one who walks out first." Keon's face was a map of conflict. To hide was to die as a dog. To fight was to die as a man. But to talk, to trust a white woman's words. "You are my wife," he said, his voice low. "I will not let you be a shield." "I am not a shield," she said, her hand tightening on his. "I am a weapon. It is the only weapon we have left." The shout from the ridge came an hour later. "They come!" Keon looked at his people. He looked at the graves they had just dug. He looked at Clara. He made his choice. "We will not hide," he said. The canyon was a trap. Briggs and his new militia, 50 men strong, rode in, their rifles ready. Jacob was at the front, his face pale and set, his eyes burning with a feverish light. Slade, the bearded man, was at Briggs's side. "They are here," Briggs called out. "They are cornered, spread out. We will—" He stopped. 3 people were walking from the shadows of the arroyo into the center of the canyon. Thomas Reed, his farmer's clothes stained with dirt, his rifle held in the crook of his arm. Keon, his arm in a sling, his rifle gone, his hand at his side. And Clara. Jacob's horse reared. "Clara!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Pa, he has them, he has no one. Jacob!" Thomas Reed called out, his voice echoing in the canyon. "He is not forcing us." Briggs's face, which had been set in a mask of righteous authority, tightened. "She is brainwashed," he said, his voice smooth. "The trauma. They have broken her. Men, we are here to—" "You are here to murder, Captain Briggs." Thomas's voice was a roar. "And I will not be silent. I was there, I am a veteran of the war. And I tell you, this man," he pointed at Briggs, "is a common murderer." A murmur went through the militia. These were farmers, not soldiers. They were here to avenge a neighbor. "He is raving," Briggs shouted. "Treason." "Is it?" Clara's voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension. "Is it treason to tell the truth?" She stepped forward. "Jacob, look at me. Am I brainwashed?" "Clara," Jacob sobbed. "He has hurt you." "He has never," Clara said, her voice ringing with a power she did not know she possessed. "Laid a hand on me in anger. He has never touched me against my will. Not once. He protected me. He saved my life when we—" She pointed at the white men. "Left me to be trampled. He married me, under his law, to protect me from his own men." She turned, her gaze falling on Slade. "But you, I remember. You and your men. You were there at the Cimarron. You were not Comanche, you were white. And you were the ones who started the shooting. You were the ones who aimed at me." Slade's hand went to his pistol. Clara turned to Briggs, her eyes blazing. "He was your man. Captain, you sent him. You set the trap. You wanted me captured or killed, so you would have an excuse to take this land." The militia was silent. They were looking at Slade. They were looking at Briggs. They were looking at the rescued maiden, who was not a victim, but an accuser. "This is madness," Briggs roared. "She is a traitor, a savage's lover. "I am my father's daughter," Clara screamed back. "And he taught me to not be a liar. You gave the order to kill them all. You told your men, no survivors. You told them to kill the women, to kill the children. I heard it. My father heard it. You are the savage. Captain, you are the only savage here." Briggs's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. His narrative, his career, his entire world was evaporating in the canyon sunlight. He had lost. He did the only thing a cornered animal could do. He drew his pistol. "Silence the savage!" he screamed, his voice a high, thin sound. He was not aiming at Clara. He was aiming at Kian. He was going to kill the proof. He fired. "Kian!" Clara shrieked. Kian, who had been standing, a silent, proud target, did not stand still. He was a warrior. He dove, not away, but forward, rolling, his good hand grabbing a handful of dust. Briggs' shot went wide. In that same heart-stopping instant, another rifle cracked. It was not Kian, it was not Clara. It was Thomas Reed. Captain Elijah Briggs, his eyes wide with surprise, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his brass-buckled belt, slid, very slowly, from his horse. He landed in the dust, dead before he hit the ground. A terrible, profound silence filled the canyon. The militia looked at the dead captain. They looked at Thomas Reed, his rifle smoking, his face a mask of stone. They looked at Jacob, who was staring, his mouth open, at the man his sister loved. They looked at Slade, who was already, very quietly, backing his horse away. The war for this one day in this one canyon was over. The villain was dead. But the future was a vast, terrifying unknown. The army would come. The railroad would come. The world would not stop. Clara Reed stood in the center of the dust, her hand outstretched. Kian, his face covered in dirt, rose from the ground and took it. She held his hand, and she held her father's gaze. She was a bridge, a fragile, impossible thing, standing in the ruins of two worlds, belonging to neither, and, somehow, to both. The gunshot echoed, and then the silence that fell upon the canyon was absolute. It was a silence heavier and more profound than any sound. The farmers and ranchers, the men of the militia, sat frozen on their horses, their rifles held slack. They stared at the body of Captain Elijah Briggs, a man who, an hour ago, had been their leader, their symbol of justice. Now he was just a corpse in the dust, his blue uniform already stained, his eyes open to the uncaring sky. Thomas Reed stood, his rifle still smoking, his face carved from old wood. He was a man who had seen too much killing, and he had just done it again. Jacob was the first to move. He stumbled from his horse, his boots kicking up dust, and ran not to his father, but to his sister. He stopped, a few feet away, his face a mask of profound confusion, shame, and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Clara," he whispered, the name a broken thing. Briggs, he lied. Clara never took her eyes from her brother. "He lied about everything. Jacob." Jacob looked at Kian, who had risen from the dust, his wounded arm held tight to his chest. He was looking at the man he had ridden out to kill, the savage who had stolen his sister, and he was seeing, for the first time, the man his father had just killed to protect. The militia began to murmur. They were not soldiers. They were farmers. They had come to avenge a neighbor's daughter, to punish a crime. They had not come to be part of a land grab, or to murder children. They looked at Thomas Reed, a man they had known for years, and they looked at the body of the captain, and they looked at Slade, the bearded volunteer who, in the silent confusion, was already backing his horse toward the mouth of the canyon, a rat fleeing a fire. No one stopped him. The death of a federal officer could not be ignored. It took 3 days for the Army to respond, but it was not the war party Briggs had wanted. It was an investigating officer, a major named Harris, a career soldier with gray hair and weary eyes. He was not a crusader. He was a man who understood logistics and who hated political messes. He read the reports, he listened, in a formal, curt interview, to Thomas Reed, who told the truth, his voice flat. He listened to the 2 farmers who had been with Thomas, who corroborated his story. He listened to Jacob, who, in a voice choked with shame, admitted that Briggs had given the order to cleanse the village, and that his father had fired only after Briggs had fired on Kian. Major Harris sighed. This was a disaster. He had a dead captain, a disgraced volunteer unit that had vanished, and a local population that was now deeply suspicious of the Army. He met Kian at the mouth of the arroyo. Thomas and Clara were there. Clara, her face calm, translated. "I do not care about your feud, Mr. Reed," Harris said, his voice clipped. "And I do not care about your honor, son," he said to Kian. "I care about the railroad. I care about the telegraph. I care about keeping this territory from exploding." He looked at the small, broken band of survivors, the women and children, the wounded. "You are not a nation," he said, his voice not cruel, just factual. "You are a handful of refugees, but you are a problem. I am here to solve the problem." "We want peace," Clara translated for Kian. "We want a place to live, a place where we will not be hunted." The negotiation was short. The agreement was fragile. Harris, on behalf of the government, offered them a tract of land. It was 2 days' ride north, a small, windy valley in the shadow of the high mesas. It was land the railroad did not want. It was land the ranchers considered poor for grazing. It was, Harris stated, a temporary reservation, a place where they could live as long as they remained peaceful and ceased all hostilities against settlers and property. It was not freedom. It was a pen. It was an admission of defeat. Kian looked at the dying chief's robe, at the orphan Tassina. He looked at Clara. He accepted a small, dry patch of earth. In exchange for their world, it was the only bargain left to be made. Thomas Reed was not arrested. Major Harris ruled the shooting a justifiable act of self-defense in a chaotic battlefield situation, a bureaucratic phrase that buried the truth deep in a file. But Thomas paid a different price. When he returned to Purgatory Bend, he was a pariah. The men in the saloon who had bought Briggs whiskey now turned their backs on him. He was a traitor. He was an Indian lover. He had shot a white officer to protect a savage. His few friends argued that he had fired to protect his daughter. But the nuance was lost. He had chosen a side, and it was not theirs. He accepted the cold shoulders. He accepted the whispers. He knew that his daughter was alive, truly alive, because of the man they despised. He knew he had done the right thing, perhaps the only truly right thing in a life full of hard compromises. That was enough. Before Kian was to lead his small band to this new, designated land, Clara knew she had to go home one last time. Kian rode with her, his arm now healing, bound in a clean sling she had made. They rode across the familiar plains, but the world was different. He stopped at the thin, wooden fence line, the one that had once marked the edge of her mother's world, and now marked the edge of his. "I will wait," he said. He would not go further. He was not welcome. Clara slid from the pony and walked up the path to the sod house. It seemed so small, so fragile, a thing of dirt and dreams that could be washed away. Her mother, Mary, was standing on the porch, her hands twisting in her apron. She had been watching the horizon for days. She saw her daughter, her skin now brown, her hair unbound, wearing the deerskin dress. "Clara," Mary whispered. She ran, her small body colliding with Clara's, and she held on, a drowning woman clutching at driftwood. "My child. I lost my child." She was weeping, deep, racking sobs. "He hurt you. What did they do to you?" "Shh, Mama," Clara said, her voice soft, stroking her mother's graying hair. "No one hurt me. I am all right. I am changed, but I am not hurt." Jacob stepped out of the doorway. His arm was still in a sling, but his face was the thing that was truly wounded. It was a mask of anger, confusion, and a deep, burning shame. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "You are going with him." He spat the word, jerking his head toward the fence line, toward Kian. "He has a name, Jacob," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "His name is Kian, and yes, I am."
"He is a savage,"
Jacob exploded, his face turning a dark, mottled red.
"They are murderers. They killed our men. They took you, Pa. He has lost his mind."
"And he saved my life," Clara said, her voice sharp, cutting through his rage. "Twice. He pulled me from under the hooves, and my father saved his life. You were there. Jacob, you saw the truth. Briggs was the murderer. Briggs was the savage." "He is different," Jacob stammered, his anger faltering, his righteous fury crumbling into a pile of confused, bitter pieces. He could not deny what he had seen. He could not deny that their father, their hero, had made a choice. "But he is not our kind. Clara, he is not white." "He is my kind," Clara said, and the words, once spoken, settled in her heart with the weight of absolute truth. Mary Reed just wept. "I do not understand," she cried, her voice muffled in her apron. "I prayed. Every night. I prayed for a good husband for you. I prayed for God to protect you." "He did," Clara said softly. She knelt, taking her mother's small, chapped hands on her own. "Mama, look at me. I am alive. I am not broken. I am—" She searched for the word. "I am whole. Is that not what you prayed for?" Mary looked at her daughter's clear, strong eyes. She saw a woman she did not recognize, a woman who had seen things a mother should never have to imagine. It was a truth her faith could not comprehend, a truth that felt like a betrayal. But she saw that her daughter was not a victim. She was, in some strange, terrifying way, saved. "I love you, Clara," she sobbed, pulling her close again. "I will always love you. May God be with you, my child." It was a blessing, and it was a goodbye. Clara stood and faced her brother. Jacob would not meet her eyes. He was leaning against the doorframe, his shoulders slumped. He was angry, he was heartbroken. He could not accept his sister's choice, but he could no longer deny the truth that Kian had saved her. He said nothing. The silence was his own private war. Clara turned and walked away. She walked down the path, past the empty corral, past the ghosts of her old life. She did not look back. She reached the fence. Kian had dismounted, and he was waiting, his face impassive. He had heard the crying.
"It is done,"
she said. He just nodded. He held out his good hand, and she took it, and he helped her onto the pony. They rode back to the arroyo. The survivors, the small, broken band, were ready. They had so little, a few horses, a few worn blankets, the tattered clothes they wore. Kian stood before them. He was no longer just a warrior. He was the chief, the leader of the remnants. He spoke, and Clara, who understood his language so much better now, heard the weariness in his voice. He was accepting the burden of their future. He was promising to lead them, to protect them, to find a way to live in this new, small, broken world. He was the bridge. Then Clara stood. She stood before the Comanche, and before her father and the two farmers who had come with him, their wagon now loaded with what few supplies Thomas could spare. "I am Clara Reed," she said, her voice clear in the silence of the canyon. "I am not a prisoner. I am not a hostage. I am the wife of Kian. I'm staying with my husband." She looked at the faces of the women, the ones who had hated her and pitied her. "This is my choice." The old woman, the one who had taught her to scrape hides, looked at her for a long time. Then she gave a single, curt nod. It was the same nod of approval she had given her by the scraping post. Tasina, the little girl, walked shyly from behind the old woman's skirt and came, not to Kian, but to Clara, and she slipped her small, brown hand into hers. Clara was no longer the outsider. She was no longer the enemy. She was one of them. The journey to the new valley took 2 days. It was a slow, sad procession, a funeral march for a way of life. Thomas Reed and his wagon followed them, a silent rear guard. When they arrived, the land was empty. It was a wide, wind-swept valley, with a small stream. But it was safe. It was theirs. They began to build. The men, now only 4, cut new lodge poles. The women began to prepare the few hides they had. Thomas, with his farmer's eye, found the richest soil near the stream and began to break the ground for a small crop of corn. He worked alongside Kian, 2 men who did not share a language, but who shared a quiet, grudging respect. 2 fathers trying to build a future. Thomas stayed for 1 week. He helped them build a small, permanent sod house, like his own, for the winter, a shelter for the old woman and the orphans. On the day he left, he stood with Clara on a small hill overlooking the tiny, new village. "It is hard land, Clara," he said. "We will make it a home, Pa," she replied. He looked at his daughter. The Wild West, the one he had come to seeking freedom, was gone. It had been a lie. He had come to escape other men, and had found only violence and greed. His time, the time of men like him, and men like Briggs, was over. He looked at Kian, who was teaching the young boys how to set a snare. The future belonged to them, to this new, strange, hybrid generation, to Clara and Kian. It was a future born of wounds, but also, he thought, a future of a kind of hope he could not quite name. "Your mother, she will pray for you. Every day," he said, his voice thick. "I know," Clara said, her own eyes wet. You tell her I am praying for her too." He hugged her, a hard, long embrace that said everything he could not. "Be strong, Clara Reed." "I am, Pa," she said. He rode away, his wagon rattling, his shoulders slumped. He did not look back. That night, the first truly peaceful night, a new fire was lit in the center of the new camp. The air was cold, and the wind still sighed down from the mesas. But there were no gunshots. There were no screams. Clara sat by the fire. She watched Tasina, who was asleep, her head in the old woman's lap. The child was, for the first time in weeks, not crying in her sleep. The other children were huddled, whispering, and one of them let out a small, suppressed giggle. It was the sound of life. Kian came and sat beside her. His arm was healing, the long, puckered scar a permanent reminder of the battle. He did not speak. He just sat, his presence a solid, warm comfort in the vast, cold darkness. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was full of loss and memory, and a deep, weary peace. Clara looked at the man beside her, her husband, her captor, her savior. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His buckskin shirt was rough and smelled of smoke and the wind. He was solid. He was real. "I have never," she whispered, her voice so low only the fire could hear it, "felt so weak and so strong in my entire life." Kian did not answer. He just reached up with his good hand, the hand that had saved her, and covered hers where it rested on her knee. His grip was firm. They sat there, two small figures against a vast, dark land, and watched the stars, the same stars, come out, one by one, in the enormous, silent sky. A year passed. The seasons, in this high, lonesome country, did not change gently. They were a hammer of heat, followed by a knife of cold. The small, ragged band of survivors in the valley endured. They had faced the winter, their first winter of this new, diminished life, and they had not died. Their settlement was still there, a handful of teepees in one sturdy sod house, a tiny, defiant puff of smoke against the vast, empty sky. But the world outside the valley was not empty anymore. The railroad, which had been a rumor, then a distant threat, was now a reality. It was a snake of iron, creeping relentlessly from the east. On a clear day, from the high ridge, they could hear it. A faint chink, chink, chink of the spike hammers, a sound that carried for miles on the wind, and sometimes they heard the whistle, a long, mournful cry that sounded, to Clara, like the loneliest sound in the world. Purgatory Bend was no longer a collection of dusty shacks. It was a town, swollen with new men, new money, and new ambitions, a flood of white faces, men who had not known Briggs, who did not know the Reeds, and who knew nothing of the bargain Major Harris had struck in a forgotten canyon. They just saw the land, and they just saw the savages who were, by some bureaucratic mistake, still living on it. Their peace was fragile. It was a piece of paper in a file in a town 50 miles away. They existed because they were, for now, too small to be a problem, and too far from the main line, but they all knew, in the way the animals know when the air changes, that it was not a permanent peace. Clara was not the same woman. Her skin was the color of light walnut, browned by a year of sun and wind. Her hands were no longer chapped and soft. They were hard, scarred, and capable. She wore the deerskin dress, now worn smooth, patched by her own hand with sinew and an awl. She had not worn a corset, or a bonnet, or a shoe with a heel, in a full year. The thought of them seemed impossibly strange. Her tongue had learned the new language, the soft, flowing sounds of the Comanche. She had learned it from the old woman, and from the children, and from Kian. She could now sit by the fire and listen to the old stories, the legends of the coyote and the eagle. And she understood. And in return, she taught them. She taught Tessina, the little orphan girl who was now her shadow, how to say good morning. She taught the women, who had once hated her, a few of the simple, silly songs her mother had taught her. They were baffled by the words, but they loved the tunes. And the valley sometimes echoed with the sound of Comanche women trying to sing about a man named Yankee Doodle. Kian had changed, too. The wound on his arm had healed, leaving a long, puckered white scar that he would carry forever. The wounds on the inside, the ones left by the fire and the bullets and the loss of his people, those were still there. But the hard, razor-sharp tension in his shoulders was gone. He was no longer a warrior waiting for the next fight, a man defined only by his hate. He was a chief. He was a husband. He was still the leader, but his leadership was different. It was quieter. It was the leadership of a man who builds, not just one who destroys. Clara saw him one afternoon with the young boys, the ones who would have been the next generation of warriors. They were practicing with their small bows. One of the boys, frustrated at missing his target, threw his bow on the ground and said he wanted a rifle. He said he wanted to fight the White Eyes. Kian, who had been watching, walked over. He did not yell. He just picked up the small bow. He looked at the boy, his face serious. "A wolf fights," Kian said, his voice quiet. And Clara, who was mending a skin nearby, paused to listen. A wolf knows only his hunger and his rage. Any animal can fight. It takes a man to protect. He touched his own scar. "I have fought. Fighting is easy. It is death. Protecting." He looked over at the sod house, where the old woman and the children were gathered. "Protecting what you love about your family is hard. That is life. A true warrior, a numunu, knows how to fight. But he knows, first, when to keep his arrow in the quiver." He smiled then, a small, rare thing that still made Clara's heart feel as if it had missed a beat. "Now, pick up your bow. The rabbits will not wait for your anger." He was, she realized, a truly great man. On the small, flat-topped hill that overlooked their valley, the one where they often sat to watch the sunset, a new landmark had appeared. Clara had built it first. She had found 2 pieces of gray, weathered driftwood by the stream, and she had bound them together with a strip of rawhide. It was a cross. A small, crude, simple cross. She had planted it in the stones, facing east, toward the home she had left. It was for her father. It was for her mother, whose prayers she still remembered. It was for the God she still believed in, a God who was, she now knew, much bigger and stranger than the one in the legalist church in Purgatory Bend. A few days later, Kian had gone up to the hill. He had found a single, smooth, black stone, and he had placed it in the ground next to her cross. With his knife, he had scratched a symbol into it, a circle for the sun, and a line, like a snake, for the river. It was for his ancestors. It was for the old chief. It was for the spirits of the land. The 2 symbols stood there, side by side, the cross and the medicine stone. They were not mixed. They were not one. They were just together. 2 stories, 2 memories, sharing the same small patch of holy ground, without trying to erase each other. Thomas Reed came, as he had promised. His wagon, rattling up the valley, was a familiar and welcome sight. He came once at the first thaw, and again in the high summer. He brought things they could not make: steel needles, a bag of flour, a heavy iron pot, and most important, he brought seed, the good corn, the kind that grew in this hard soil. He and Kian still did not speak much. They did not need to. Their relationship was one of mutual, silent respect. Thomas would bring a new, sharp axe head. Kian would look at the steel, test its edge, and nod. And Kian would have, waiting for him, a perfectly tanned and smoked buffalo hide, the best in the camp. Thomas would run his hand over its softness, and he would nod. They were 2 men who had seen the worst of the world. They had both taken a life to protect what they loved. They understood each other in a way that words could not touch. "He is a good man, Clara," Thomas said to her on his last visit, as he watched Kian showing the boys how to brace the new sod wall. "I know, Pa," she said. "And you," he said, looking at her, at the glow in her cheeks, at the peace in her eyes. "You are a good woman." That evening, Clara was sitting by the fire, mending one of Kian's moccasins. Tassina, the orphan, was asleep with her head in Clara's lap, a deep, trusting sleep. The old woman was humming a low, tuneless song. Clara paused, her sinew needle in midair. She felt a movement. It was not the child in her lap. It was a small, insistent, fluttering kick deep inside her own body. A slow smile spread across her face. She put her mending aside and placed her hand, the one that was now so brown and scarred, on her own belly, under the soft deerskin. Her stomach was just beginning to swell with a gentle, undeniable curve. She looked up, across the fire. Kian was watching her. He had not been mending. He had not been talking. He had just been watching her. He saw her hand on her stomach. He saw the look on her face. He knew. His face, so often a mask of a warrior's duty, softened. The lines of care around his eyes eased, and he smiled. A true, unguarded, joyful smile that lit his face from the inside out. Clara felt her heart fill, so full she thought it might burst. This was it. This was the reason. The love she had felt in the cave. The passion that had been so new and terrifying. It had not been an end. It had been a beginning. It was not just a feeling. It was a choice. It was a responsibility. It was this new life. A life that was half her, half him. A life that was a bridge. This was her home. Not the place she was born, but the place she had fought to protect. The place that was now growing inside her. This was her family. Not just the one of her blood, but the one of her choice. And this was justice. Not the kind in a uniform or in a book, but the simple, hard, true justice of a father doing what was right, and a husband protecting his own. The sun was setting. The sky was on fire, a sea of orange and deep, bruised purple. Kian rose. He had to check the horse line, to make his nightly patrol around the ridge, to watch for the lights of the new, encroaching world. He walked to his pony, but he paused and looked back at her. He held out his hand. Clara gently moved Tessina's head onto a sleeping robe. She stood, her body filled with a new, pleasant weight, and walked to him. She took his hand. He did not just help her mount. He swung himself up, and then, with his good arm, he pulled her up, seating her in front of him, just as he had done on that first, terrible day. But this time, it was not a capture. She leaned back against his chest, her head fitting perfectly into the hollow of his shoulder. His arms came around her. One hand held the reins, the other, his left hand, the one with the healed scar, came to rest on her stomach. He held her, and he held their child. A silent, protective embrace. They rode, a single shadow, to the top of the hill, to the place where the cross and the medicine stone stood side by side. They looked out. The valley, their small, fragile world, was below them, bathed in the soft, glowing light of the fires. And in the far distance, to the east, they saw it, the thin black line of the iron rail, a scar on the skin of the prairie. And as they watched, a plume of black smoke rose against the purple sky. The night train, its whistle came to them, faint, lonely, a cry of the future that was rushing toward them, a future of steam and wire and 1,000 new, hungry faces. They were not safe. Not really. They both knew this peace was borrowed time. They knew the men on that train would one day look at this valley, and they would want it. The war was not over. Kian looked down at Clara. Clara looked up at her husband. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had no illusions. They knew it would not be easy. They knew the world was hard, and that their fight was far from done. But they had each other, and they had the child that was coming. They were together, and they would find a way to live. A girl, once forced into a marriage she did not understand, and a warrior, once defined by a hate he had been taught his whole life, sat as one on a single horse. Their hands were intertwined, their shadows joined in the fading light. They were a testament, a quiet, stubborn proof that even here, in the high, lonesome, wild West, in a land of violence and greed, there was still a place for something new, a place for love, a place to grow, A place to call home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below so we can share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story be heard by many more.